He was expelled for writing formulas that took 40 lines, where others needed only 3. The accountant, that was his name in the tower, the one who turned magic into bookkeeping. There was one thing they didn't know. Between those 3 symbols lay 80 steps that only he could see. The rain hurls handfuls of gravel into his face. Chedahan descends the muddy path toward the cove. A sack of soggy rice pulls his shoulder backward. In his pocket is a letter from the Tower of the Dry Leaf. The council wrote that Master Che no longer keeps pace with modern magic. 20 years of service, 17 treatises, not a single victory in duels. The result? A sack of rice, an old cloak, a road to nowhere. 3 days ago, an 18-year-old adept burned his notes in 4 seconds. Rahan was deriving the 3rd line of defense, the 3rd of 40. The boy didn't wait for the remaining 37. No one ever waited. In the towers, they loved short formulas, 3 signs, 5 signs, beautiful and fast. And Rahan remembered what everyone else had forgotten. The ancients kept the omitted steps in mind as self-evident. Modern magicians had forgotten they ever existed. He remembered because he'd spent 20 years copying scrolls in the archives, and one day began to see the gaps. 41 years. No family, no home, no students. One thought in his head: to live to see retirement and write it all down. He reaches the village as twilight devours the last light. Norin, a handful of houses pressed against the cliff above the water. The roofs are leaking. It smells of fish and wet wood. On the shore, an old woman sits right in the rain, cursing her net. The knots are rotting. The threads were slipping apart under her fingers. The fish escape through the holes faster than they can be patched. Rakan sits down next to her on a wet rock and asks for a needle. The old woman looks at him as if he were mad, but she gives him the needle. He untangles the knots. His fingers move of their own accord, and suddenly he freezes. The knots lie in a familiar pattern. He has seen it 1,000 times in ancient scrolls. The pattern of the 3rd retention formula, only turned inside out, like a reflection in water. Rakan rotates the net a quarter turn. If read not as a net but as a formula, if the missing steps between the knots are inserted, his fingers move along the dots of their own accord. He isn't mending it. He is completing it. Each knot becomes a symbol in a long formula. The net clicks softly and falls still. The old woman lifts the edge. Water runs down the threads, but not a single drop passes through the mesh. The net holds the water as glass holds wine. The old woman drops the pipe. Rakan blushes to his ears and mumbles that he'll unravel it all right now, that it was an accident. The old woman grabs his sleeve. "Son, don't unravel it, please." He falls silent, and he can't remember the last time someone asked him not to undo what he'd done. In the tower, his work was erased, rewritten, burned. 20 years. And here, a woman on the wet shore holds his sleeve and asks him to leave it. Her name is So Mei. She is 28, not an old woman. Just the rain and 3 years of widowhood have aged her hands. Her husband didn't return from the fog. Since then, she's gone out to sea on her own. She mends the nets herself. She answers to the village elders herself. She leads him into the house and sets a bowl of hot soup before him. Fish soup with seaweed. Simple, the best thing he's eaten in a year in the tower. There, they fed him heartily, but indifferently. Here, the soup is made for someone who is soaked and frozen. Somei asks who he is. Rahan says, "Former master of the 3rd tower. They got rid of me because I was no longer needed. There's nowhere else to go." She nods and lays out the truth. There are 203 people in Norin. In 2 weeks, the tax collector from Duke Kong Tae Son will arrive. The tax is triple because the Duke is at war with the Blood Moon pirates. Villages that don't pay become his direct possession, and the people are dispersed to the shipyards. Norin is the last free village on the entire northern coast, and if he can mend nets as well as he did today, he'll find a place. Rahan wants to say he has no intention of mending anything, that he wants to live out his days in peace and write his treatises. But he nods and says he'll try. Morning greets him with fog. A thick white wall fills the bay to the brim. He steps onto the shore and cannot see the sea. The fog smells strange, not just of salt, of something he once knew but has forgotten. The fog moves unlike ordinary fog. It seems to breathe. It draws in and pushes out, as if alive. Rahan shakes his head and gets to work on what he knows best, on the repairs. By evening, Some's net is ready. Every knot sits in its place like a symbol in a formula. On the third day, Old Man Pak's boat goes missing. He set out in the morning and didn't return by nightfall. The fog is so thick that shapes vanish 5 steps away. The village gathers on the shore and remains silent. To search in such fog would mean losing another boat. Some stands by the water with her lips pressed together. 3 years ago, they stood just like this and were silent when her husband didn't return. Rahan asks for a bowl of salt. He sits down on the wet sand and draws 12 concentric circles with the salt. Then he takes a small copper bell from Some's belt and places it in the center. He counts on his fingers. He whispers, 10 minutes, 20. The villagers twirl their fingers at their temples. He pays no attention. He falls silent. The bell tinkles, softly, once. And in that very second, far away in the fog, a mile or so from the shore, a reply tinkles, the same note, pure and clear. Some stops breathing. Rahan points into the fog. There. Old Man Pak hears the ringing and heads toward it. An hour later, his boat emerges from the whiteness, alive, with a full catch. He presses a wet copper bell to his chest, one he never had, but which had been ringing in the boat all this time. Some asks how. Rahan says he didn't call the old man. He simply finished ringing the bell. Now the old man knows where his mate is. That evening, for the first time, the village doesn't call him master. The fisherman slaps him on the back. Thank you, Ajosi Han. Uncle Han. Rahan is nearly in tears at those 2 words. In the tower, he was Master Cho, an empty shell filled with long formulas. But here, he is Uncle Han, the man who saved Old Man Park with a bell and a bowl of salt. He sits by the hearth and thinks that in the morning he needs to check the village headman's roof, and herbalist Yoon Ara's mortar, and Kim's boat which has a leak in the bottom. Just to check, nothing more. Rahan started with the village headman's roof. Village headman Kim Dae-ho was a heavy-set man with a red face and a constant habit of scratching the back of his head when he didn't know what to say. And he almost never knew. The roof of his house was leaking in 3 places. The tiles had sagged and cracked. Rahan climbed up early in the morning and spent 2 hours silently crawling along the slope, touching every tile. The village head stood below, fidgeting nervously. He asked what was so interesting up there. Ra Khan replied that the tiles were laid incorrectly, not because they were poorly installed, but because they had never been laid with an understanding of how they were supposed to function. Each tile is part of a whole. If you lay them in a specific order, with a specific angle of inclination and distance between the edges, the water doesn't just run off. It follows the only correct path and doesn't touch the joints. The foreman said that's not how you lay tiles. Rahan nodded and said that's exactly why his roof was leaking. He worked for 3 days. He took off all the tiles. He washed them. He counted them. He laid them out in order on the ground like a formula. Then he began to put them back, each tile in its place, with the exact gap, at the exact angle. When he finished, the roof looked just as it had before. But when the first rain fell, not a single drop got inside. The village head stood in the dry house and stared up with his mouth agape. He asked what Rahan had done to it. Rahan said nothing. He just put it back correctly. Next was Yoon Ara's mortar. Yoon Ara came to him on her own. She didn't want to come. You could tell by the way she stood on the threshold of Some's house, straight as a stick, lips pressed together, 7 knives on her belt, and a single glare sharp enough to split wood. She was 26 years old, the only healer in all of Norin, a student of a wandering herbalist. She didn't trust magicians. Her older sister had once been treated at the tower. They brought her to the tower on a stretcher. They promised the formulas would work. A week later, they sent her back. They said the formula had worked, but her body couldn't handle it. Fine words. Her sister died 3 days after returning. Since then, Yoon Ara had treated people only with herbs. For 20 years she had collected recipes. For 20 years she had dried roots according to her grandmother's rules. And now she stood before a stranger, a mage, and couldn't believe she had come here on her own. She said her mortar had cracked, that the decoctions had grown weaker, that if he could mend nets, he could mend the mortar too. Her voice was steady, but her fingers on the knife handle had turned white. Rahan didn't argue. He didn't even stand up right away. He asked her to sit down and tell him exactly how her grandmother had dried the wormwood, what kind of water she'd used to soak the roots, at what time of day she gathered the wormwood. Yun Ara sat down. She hadn't planned on talking for long, but Rahan listened as no one had ever listened before. He listened like a man who sees a line of a formula in every word. An hour later, Yun Ara caught herself talking about the smell of wormwood in August, and how her grandmother ground the seeds only with her left hand because her right was weaker. Rahan was taking notes. Real notes, not formulas, words. Then he asked for a mortar. Yun Ara brought it. A heavy stone mortar with a crack running across the bottom. Rahan turned it over in his hands. He sniffed it. He ran his finger along the crack. He said the crack wasn't the main problem. The problem was that the mortar worked against the herbs. The stone was too smooth on the inside. The herbs slipped. Yun Ara pressed harder. She was wasting her strength. The decoction absorbed the anger in her hands instead of the even pressure. Yun Ara wanted to take offense, but he said it so gently and seriously that there was nothing to be offended about. He asked for until tomorrow. Yun Ara left. Rahan sat with the mortar all night. Somei saw the light in his corner until dawn. He wasn't casting spells. He was working with a needle and salt, scratching thin lines into the stone. Not a drawing, a formula. A long one, 40 lines. A formula that took into account everything Yun Ara had told him. How her grandmother dried the wormwood, which hand she used to grind it, at what time she gathered it. The formula didn't replace Yun Ara's knowledge. It amplified it, made every movement more precise, every press smoother. In the morning, he brought the mortar back. Yun Ara took it silently. She ground a handful of the root as a test. She poured water over it. When the decoction had steeped, she sniffed it and froze. Then she tasted it on her tongue. This decoction was twice as strong as usual. No, 3 times. Yun Ara set the bowl on the table and looked at her hands, then at the mortar. Then at Rahan, who was standing in the doorway, wringing his hands in his usual apologetic manner. She asked quietly what he had done. Rahan said he hadn't changed her recipe. He had simply made the mortar work with her, not against her. Yun Ara turned her back to the wall. Her shoulders were shaking. For 20 years, she had been proving to everyone, and to herself, that herbs were stronger than formulas. And this man hadn't argued. He had simply taken her knowledge and respected it. He hadn't dismissed it. He hadn't replaced it. He had respected it. An hour later, she returned to the porch. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. She said that if his back started to hurt from his stupid habit of sitting on wet rocks, he should come to her. She would cure him, for free, but only once. That same evening, the fisherman Cho Nam-gil came to Rahan, a young, healthy man with heavy hands and a disgruntled face. He said he didn't understand why a stranger was meddling in their affairs, that they'd mended nets before him and would continue to do so after him, that they shouldn't have touched Yun Ara's mortar, that Somei spent too much time by his hearth and people didn't like it. Rahan listened in silence. Cho Nam-gil wasn't a bad man. He was tired of having to go out to sea every day and count every evening whether the catch would be enough to pay the tribute and feed his family. When a stranger comes and does in 2 days what you couldn't do in years, it's no joy, it's humiliation. Rahan understood. For 20 years, he himself had been the guy everyone passed over. He said he wasn't, that he was just a repairman, and that if Cho Nam-gil had anything broken, he could bring it to him. Cho Nam-gil snorted, turned around, and walked away. 3 days later, he returned. Silently, he placed a knife with a cracked handle at the doorstep, and he left without looking back. Rahan picked up the knife and smiled. Then he sat down and began to count. That evening, Somei asked him why he was doing this. Why was he fixing other people's things when he'd been kicked out precisely because he was like that? Rahan was silent for a long time. Then he said he didn't know. That when he looks at a broken thing, he sees what it's missing. He sees it so clearly that he can't look away. It's like seeing a hungry person and having bread in your pocket. You can walk past, but then you'll lie awake all night thinking about him. So May listened. She looked at his hands, the long, slender fingers of a scholar, with calluses from a needle on his fingertips. She thought that these hands hadn't repaired anything for living people in 20 years. They had only copied scrolls, and now they had found the purpose for which they were created. She didn't say this out loud. She simply poured him some tea and stepped out onto the porch. The fog over the bay was thick and white, and it seemed to her that it was closer than usual, as if listening. Rahan repaired the village headman's roof by rearranging the tiles like a formula, and improved young Ara's mortar by inscribing a formula into the stone that enhances her own recipes rather than replacing them. Young Ara accepted help from a magician for the first time. The fisherman Cho Nam Gil expressed his displeasure with the stranger, but still brought him a broken knife. It is important to remember that there were about 10 days left before the tax collector's arrival, and that So May had noticed the fog's strange behavior. Rahan spent 2 nights repairing Cho Nam Gil's knife. Not because the knife was complicated. The knife was simple. A fisherman's knife, a wide blade for filleting, a wooden handle. A crack ran from the pommel to the middle. Any blacksmith could have fitted a new handle in an hour, but Rahan was no blacksmith. He sat with the knife on his lap and at first just looked at it. Then he asked So May which hand Cho Nam Gil used to hold the knife, which fish he filleted most often, whether he worked standing or sitting. So May answered everything. She knew everyone in Nordyong. Rahan nodded and took notes. Then he picked up the handle and began to work. He didn't replace the wood. He didn't glue the crack. He ran a needle along the crack and sewed it up, literally, with a thin thread laced with salt. Each stitch fell into a specific order. The seam looked like a seam, but it was a formula, a 32-line formula. It took into account Cho Nam Gil's grip, his habit of pressing down with his thumb while cutting, his height, his sore left shoulder, which So May had mentioned. When Rahan finished, the knife looked repaired. An old handle with a seam, nothing special. He left the knife at Cho Nam Gil's doorstep that morning and walked away. By evening, Cho Nam Gil had come to So May's house. He stood in silence. Then he said the knife fit in his hand as if it had known his palm all his life, that he'd filleted the morning's catch in half the usual time, that his shoulder hadn't ached once all day. He didn't say thank you. He said something else. He asked if Rahan could take a look at his boat. Rahan nodded. That was the beginning. Over the next week, 3 more people came to him. Fisherman Moon with a bucket full of holes. The village headman's wife with a spinning wheel that vibrated and snapped the thread. A boy about 10 years old with a wooden toy. A little horse missing a leg. Rahan fixed everything. Each time he asked questions first. Who would be using it? How? Why? He asked the boy questions so seriously as if he were repairing a siege weapon rather than a toy. Which hand do you hold it with? Do you roll it across the floor or carry it in your pocket? And does it sleep with you or on the shelf? The boy answered solemnly and in detail. Rahan took notes. Then he spent 2 hours fixing the horse. He glued the leg back on, sanded it down, and ran a needle dipped in salt along all the seams. The boy got his horse back and ran off. An hour later he returned with 2 friends. One had a broken boat, the other had a whistle that wouldn't make a sound. Rakan sighed. May, behind him, laughed quietly. It was the first time he'd ever heard her laugh. The sound was short and hoarse, like that of a person who had forgotten how to laugh but was trying to remember. The tax collector arrived on the 9th day. His name was Han Ji-woo, a young mage from the emerging 7th tower, about 25 years old, a spotless cloak, polished boots, a gold clasp bearing the coat of arms of Duke Kong Tae-sun. He arrived on horseback with 2 guards. He stood in the square in front of the village headman's house and announced that Norin must pay triple the usual tribute in accordance with the decree on coastal military maintenance. Grain, fish, salt, and silver. Village headman Kim Dae-ho scratched the back of his head and said nothing. The villagers gathered around. People stared at the ground. Everyone knew they couldn't afford triple the tribute. They had barely scraped together the last one. The children had gone hungry for 2 weeks. Rahan stood in the back rows. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. But Han Ji-woo was smarter than he looked. He didn't argue with the village head. He walked through the village. He looked around. He took notes. And when he reached the shore, he saw Somei's net. It lay on the rocks, drying after the morning haul. Han Ji-woo stopped. He crouched down. He touched the knots. He was a magician. Not a great one. Not a genius. But skilled enough to see. He ran his fingers over the knots, and his face changed. First surprise, then confusion, then recognition. He stood up and slowly scanned the village headman's roof, Moon's bucket standing by the well, the spinning wheel on the porch. He saw it all. Ra-han stood in the shadow of the barn and watched as Han Ji-woo read his work, like a man reading a book one letter at a time. Their eyes met. Han Ji-woo didn't say a word. He silently returned to his horse, mounted it, told the village head he would return in a month for the tribute, and rode away, without guards, alone. The village breathed a sigh of relief. Somei approached Ra-han. She said he had seen it. Ra-han nodded. He knew that Han Ji-woo had seen it, and he knew that he wouldn't keep quiet. He was a mage. Mages don't keep quiet when they see what they shouldn't see. Ra-han said they needed to prepare. Somei asked for what? Ra-han looked at the fog over the bay and said quietly, "For everything." That night, Ra-han didn't sleep. He went down to the shore and sat by the water. The fog hung low. White wisps crept across the surface of the bay as if alive. Ra-han watched and counted. Not formulas. Days. Han Ji-woo would reach the city in 4 days. He'd send a report to the tower in a day. The reply would come in a week or two. Then a decision. Then action. He had maybe a month and a half. Maybe 2. Or maybe less if Han Ji-woo didn't go to the city but sent a messenger bird directly from the nearest garrison. Ra-han counted and felt a familiar chill creeping up his spine. Fear. An old acquaintance. For 20 years he had feared exams, feared duels, feared the tower's council. Now he feared for the 203 people who, in 10 days, had come to call him Uncle Han. He looked at his hands. Long fingers, calluses from the needle. With these hands, he couldn't cast a single fireball, couldn't put up a shield, couldn't do any of the things normal mages do. But he could repair, could finish what others started. He could see in broken things what was missing from them. He stood up and walked along the shore. He stopped by an old boat pulled up onto the sand. He looked at it for a long time. Then he crouched down and touched the planks. Each plank is part of a formula. A boat is not a set of planks nailed together. A boat is a formula that must keep a person afloat and carry him home. He saw this formula as clearly as he saw his own hands. And this formula was broken in 8 places. Not cracks, not rot. The planks themselves were out of place, like words in a sentence that had been put in the wrong order. Ra-han took out a needle. He took out a small bag of salt. He sat down next to the boat, right on the wet sand, and he began to work. The first boat, the first real test. If he could rewrite the boat entirely, if every plank fell into its place like a symbol in a formula, then this boat would sail against the wind, without magic, without a spark, simply because it would be made correctly. He worked until dawn. The fog hung over him and didn't move, as if it were watching. Ra-han repaired Chonam-gil's knife, earning his respect, and began taking orders from the villagers. The tax collector, Han Ji-woo, arrived in Norin, saw the formulas on the net and the objects, and left in silence. Ra-han realized he had about 2 months before serious consequences. That night, he began working on the first boat. It is important to remember that Han Ji-woo will send a report about the forbidden long record style to the towers. The boat was called the Lame Seagull. That's what its owner, the fisherman Pei Sun-ho, had named it 12 years ago when he built it from whatever he had on hand. Crooked planks, a slanted keel. It sailed sideways and dug its bow into any wave larger than a palm. Pei Sun-ho had long since given up on it. He only went out to sea when the waters were calm. He caught little. He often went hungry. Ra-han worked on the Lame Seagull for 7 days, 10 hours every day. He didn't take the boat apart. He didn't replace any planks. He didn't nail anything new in place. He worked with a needle and salt. He went along every seam. He pierced the wood at points only he could see. He joined the planks together, not with nails, but with a formula, a long one, 40 lines for each seam. He took everything into account. The weight of Pei Sun-ho, his habit of sitting on the starboard side, the height of the waves in the cove during different months, the direction of the wind, the depth under the keel. Each plank fell into place like a word in a sentence that had finally found its meaning. On the fourth day, Somei began bringing him food to the shore. He forgot to eat. She would silently set the bowl down beside him and leave. Sometimes he would find the bowl cold 2 hours later. Somei didn't scold him. She just brought a new one. On the sixth day, Yunara came. She looked at his hands. His fingers were worn down to the flesh from the needle and salt. She silently took ointment out of her pocket and treated his hands. Rahan tried to refuse. Yunara said that if he ruined his fingers, who would fix their things? It wasn't sympathy. It was practical calculation. But she applied the ointment very gently. On the seventh day, he finished. The lame seagull stood on the sand and looked just as it had before. The same crooked planks, the same slanted keel, but Rahan could see that every seam was now in place. Each plank spoke to its neighbor. The boat had become whole. Baesung-ho launched it with the distrust of a man who had been deceived his life. He sat on the starboard side. He took the oar and froze. The boat sat level. It didn't list. It didn't dig in. It stood as if cast in one piece. He gently moved the oar. The lame seagull moved forward, easily, smoothly, as if gliding not on water but on oil. Baesung-ho rowed faster and faster. Then he hoisted the sail. The wind blew from the sea toward the shore, against the current. Any other boat in the bay would have stopped. The lame seagull caught the wind and moved forward, against the wind. The sail didn't flutter. It didn't flap. It worked. Every stitch on it was also a formula. Rahan had managed to copy it down, and the sail was still working on the hull. Baesung-ho returned an hour later, with a boat full of fish. He pulled the seagull ashore, sat down nearby, and was silent for a long time. Then he stood up and bowed to Rahan, low, to the waist, the way one bows to the eldest in the family. Rahan waved his hands and asked him not to. Baesung-ho didn't listen. He walked through the village and told everyone. By evening, 5 fishermen were standing outside Somei's house. Each had a boat. Each asked to take a look. Rahan stood before them and realized that 5 boats meant 10 weeks of work at his pace, and he didn't have 10 weeks. He sat on the porch and thought until dark. The fishermen waited. Somei brought him tea and sat down beside him. She didn't ask. She just sat there. Rahan drank his tea and did the math. 5 boats, 7 days each, 35 days. He might have 50 days before a reply came from the towers. If he worked on 2 boats at the same time, he could make it. But then the formulas would interfere with each other. Each boat is designed for one person. 2 side by side would clash. If only. Rahan set down his cup. Somei looked at him. She was already recognizing that expression. When his eyes went out of focus and he stared through the wall, he saw a formula, not just 1, 5, and between them, a connecting passage, like between schools of magic that the towers cannot connect. But Rahan writes long enough to insert passages between them. Fire warms the water without boiling it away. The protection moves along with the boat. 5 boats operate as a fleet, not as 5 separate vessels. He stood up. He told the fishermen that he needed all 5 boats on the shore, side by side, tomorrow morning, and that he would need a lot of salt. For the next 3 weeks, Rakan worked like a man possessed. He rose before dawn and went to bed after midnight. The 5 boats stood in a row on the shore. He moved from one to the next, piercing them with a needle. He drew with salt. He whispered, counting on his fingers. The village had grown accustomed to this sight. A stooped man in an old raincoat walks between the boats and talks to the wood. Children would run over to watch. Rakan didn't chase them away. Sometimes he explained what he was doing, not with formulas, in simple words. He said that every plank wants to stand straight, just as a person wants to stand straight. You just have to help it find its place. The children listened and nodded. They didn't understand magic, but they understood repair. Among the children was a girl, quiet, skinny, with big, serious eyes. She came every day and sat off to the side. She didn't approach. She didn't ask questions. She just watched his hands. Rahan noticed her, but didn't call her over. He didn't want to scare her away. She was about 12 or 13. Somei said her name was Park Han-nil, an orphan. She lives with her aunt. She repairs other people's things for food. The tower rejected her when she was 8. They said she had no spark. Ever since then, she's been convinced she's defective. Rahan listened and said nothing. He knew that feeling. For 20 years, he had been a defective mage. Too slow, too long, too detailed for a world that loves things short and beautiful. On the 12th day of work, Han Yul approached. She stood beside him and was silent for a minute. Then she said she could see a pattern in his seams. She said that the seams on different boats are similar but not identical, like a single song sung by different voices. Rahan stopped working. He turned to her and looked at her for a long time. Then he asked her to show him her hands. Han Yul held out her palms, small, calloused from someone else's work, with scraped knuckles. Rahan looked at her fingers and saw what the tower hadn't seen, or hadn't wanted to see. This girl had no spark. A spark is a mage's ability to gather mana and fling it outward in a short burst. Han Yul couldn't do that, but she had hands and eyes that saw the pattern in the seam, and a perfect memory for patterns. He told her that the spark was a lie spread by the towers, that magic doesn't begin with a spark, it begins with the hands, and that her hands were better than his. Han Yul looked at him and held her breath. He said he would teach her, until she herself said enough. Han Yul didn't answer. She sat down next to him on the sand and didn't get up again until evening. From that day on, she never left his side. Rahan rewrote the lame seagull's boat as a formula, and it sailed against the wind. 5 fishermen brought their boats, and Rahan began working on them simultaneously, using coordinating transitions between the formulas. The girl Park Han Yul, whom the tower had rejected for lacking a spark, became his first student. It is important to remember that this is the 3rd week of the approximately 7-week wait for a possible response from the tower, and that Rahan is working himself to the bone. Han Yul studied in a way Rahan hadn't seen in 20 years at the tower. In the tower, students memorized formulas by rote. They repeated after the master, they wrote short lines and tried to make them even shorter. Hanu didn't memorize, she watched. Rahan showed her a seam on the boat and said, "Here, the plank wants to turn right, but I'm asking it to go straight. See?" Hanu leaned in and saw, not a formula, not symbols, the wood itself. She saw where the plank wanted to go and where it needed to go. 3 days later, she made her first seam on her own, crooked, uncertain, but correct. Rahan looked at it and said, "Good." Hanu burst into tears, not from joy, from surprise. She had never been praised for her handiwork. People pitied her, a defective girl, without a spark, mending others' things for a bowl of porridge. And now, a grown man was looking at her crooked seam and saying, "Good." Rahan waited until she stopped crying. Then he said, "Now the second one." She wiped her face with her sleeve and picked up the needle. By the end of the first week of training, Hanu was tying knots on the nets. Not formulaic ones yet, just ordinary ones. But Rahan showed her the correct order, the very one he had seen in Somei's net on the first evening. The 3rd retention formula pattern turned inside out. Han Yul memorized it after just one demonstration. Her fingers repeated the pattern exactly, without mistakes. Rahan watched her and thought that the tower had discarded the diamond because it didn't sparkle the way they were used to. A spark is a trick, bright and useless. But Han Yul's hands are a tool that will work for a lifetime. Somei was the first to notice the change. She told Rahan that he had changed. He asked how. She said he had stopped apologizing. Before, every other sentence of his began with, "I'm sorry," or "Excuse me." Now he said, "Do it this way," or "No, not here, but to the left." No apologies. Rahan thought about it and realized she was right. He hadn't noticed when it had happened. Maybe when Han Yul sat down next to him on the sand. Maybe even earlier, when Old Man Park was crying on the shore, hugging the bell. Or when Yu Nara turned her back to the wall, her shoulders shaking. Something was changing. For 20 years, people had called him a nobody, and he had grown accustomed to thinking of himself as a nobody. But now he had no time to think that way because he had to work. 5 boats, a student, a village that brought something broken every day. Grandma Kim's cat refused to eat from the new bowl. Rahan looked at the bowl and discovered that he had accidentally inscribed the formula for repelling salt on it while repairing the crack. The formula tickled the cat, and she wouldn't go near it. Rahan spent 2 hours rewriting the bowl to remove the extra. Grandma Kim stood nearby and offered advice. The cat sat on the fence and watched with an expression of deep contempt. Week 5. All 5 boats were ready. Rahan launched them all on the same day. All 5 fishermen got into their boats. they hoisted the sails. The wind was blowing from the sea. The boats moved forward, against the wind, all five, in sync, like the 5 fingers of one hand. Their coordinated maneuvers worked. The boats didn't get in each other's way. On the contrary, together they moved faster than they would have alone. Their techniques complemented each other. The water parted before them as if before something whole and right. The fisherman returned by noon, with a catch that would last 3 days. In a single 3, Chonamgil was the first to pull his boat ashore. He looked at Rahan and said nothing. But that evening, he brought him a jug of rice wine. He silently set it by the threshold and left. Rahan drank the wine with Some on the porch and looked out at the bay. The fog hung like a wall, white and thick, but something in it had changed. Rahan couldn't figure out exactly what. The fog seemed closer, or maybe not. The fog stood just the same, but now it was as if it were listening. Rahan shook his head. He was tired. 5 weeks without proper sleep. His eyes were seeing things that weren't there. In her 6th week, Hanil wove her first formulaic net, a small one, the size of her palm. Rahan had shown her the principle that morning and left to repair the spinning wheel for the fisherman Jan's wife. When he returned in the evening, Hanil was sitting on the shore with the finished net. She had stretched the net between sticks and was holding it over a rock. Fog settled on the threads. Drops gathered in knots. They trickled down and dripped into the cup held beneath. Pure, fresh water, squeezed from the fog. Rahan watched and couldn't move. He hadn't shown her this. He had shown her the principle. The knot that holds, the knot that releases, and the space between them. Hanil figured out the rest on her own. She realized that if she held the water from the fog and then let it go, it would make a filter, a condenser, a net that turns fog into drinking water. Rahan sat down beside her. He asked how she'd figured it out. Hanil shrugged and said the network had wanted it. Rahan closed his eyes. He thought that if anyone from the tower had seen this, a 12-year-old girl without a spark had, in a single day, created something that no tower on the continent had ever created. Not because they couldn't, because they hadn't thought of it that way. The towers made weapons, shields, formulas for killing and defense. It hadn't occurred to anyone to make a formula that gives people water. Rahan helped Hanil weave a larger net. In 2 days, they made a 2x2 cubit sheet. They stretched it over a frame by the well. By the barrel under the frame held 30 buckets of clean water. For 20 years, Norin had been drinking brackish water from the only well. The children had stomach aches. The elderly suffered from kidney problems, and now there was a barrel of clean, fresh water. So May came to the well in the morning. She scooped some up. She tasted it. She set the bucket down on the edge of the barrel. She stood there for a moment. Then she walked through the village, knocking on every door. "Come to the well. Try it." By noon, the whole village of Norin had gathered around the barrel. People drank and said nothing. Then they drank some more. A mother of 3 stood with a bucket in her hands and couldn't stop. The water was clear, soft, without a hint of salt. Village head Kim Dae-ho scooped up a bucketful and looked at Rahan, then at Hanil, who was standing next to the teacher and hiding her hands behind her back. The village head bowed, not to Rahan, Hanul. The girl blushed to the roots of her hair and hid behind the teacher's back. Rahan placed his hand on the top of her head. He didn't say anything, but Some saw his face, and she saw that he was biting his lip to keep from bursting into tears right there by the barrel. Yun Ara came to him that same evening. She brought a jar of hand ointment and a jar of ointment for Hanil, a separate one, smaller, with a different formula, because a child's skin is thinner. Rahan took both jars and said thank you. Yunara sat down on the porch. She said she hated magic. Rahan nodded. She said she hated magicians. Rahan nodded again. She said she hated him. Rahan waited. Yunara was silent for a moment. Then she said quietly that she couldn't hate him because he was the only mage who hadn't ruined anything she'd built. Rahan said he wasn't a mage. He was an accountant. Yunara snorted, but the corners of her lips twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it wasn't hostility anymore. She left. Rahan sat there with 2 jars of ointment and thought that life was a strange thing. 5 weeks ago, he was nothing, an outcast with a sack of rice. And now he had a student who provided the village with water from the mist, and a healer who brought him ointment for his hands, and a fisherwoman who set hot soup before him every evening, and 203 people who called him Uncle Han. He looked at the mist. The mist hung motionless, and Ra-Han thought he saw something flicker in its white depths. Not a shadow, not a light. Movement, as if someone very far away had turned their head and looked in his direction.
Ra-Han blinked. The fog was empty. He sighed and went to sleep. Tomorrow he had to start on the second batch of boats and teach Hanil the second knot and check the sword. May had mentioned that a stranger had come to the village with a wound in her side, with a sword. He had to take a look. Hanil had made rapid progress in her training and had independently created a net that extracted fresh water from the fog. For the first time in 20 years, the village had clean drinking water. 5 refurbished boats set out to sea and operated as a single fleet. Yunara began to soften toward Ra-Han. It's important to remember that a stranger, a woman with a sword and a wound in her side, had come to the village. That's Li Rin. There are about 2 weeks left before a possible response from the towers. The woman was found by So Mei. She was lying face down behind the shed by the pier. Her cloak was soaked through. The hilt of a long sword and a worn scabbard protruded from beneath it. Her left side was wrapped in a rag stained brown with old blood. So Mei turned her over and saw her face. Young, narrow, with sharp cheekbones and lips pressed together even in unconsciousness. So Mei called out to Yungara. The healer ran over with her bag and immediately set to work on the wound. The cut was deep, not a fisherman's cut, a battle wound, from a blade. Yungara washed, treated, and bandaged it. Then she said the woman had lost a lot of blood and needed rest and herbal tea for 3 days. Ra-Han stood to the side and looked at the sword. Even in its sheath, he could see the blade was expensive. Not village-made, not market-grade, family steel, fine engraving on the hilt, a coat of arms. Ra-Han didn't know much about the coats of arms of the southern houses, but he understood that a sword like this wasn't carried by an ordinary soldier. The woman woke up on the second day. Her name was Li Rin, 24 years old. She said that and fell silent. Yun-Ara asked where she was from. Li Rin didn't answer. She only asked if she could stay the night. So-Mai said she could. Li Rin stayed for the night, then for a second night. On the 3rd day, she got up and stepped out onto the porch. Ra-Han was sitting by the dock, working on the second batch of boats. Ha-Nil was sitting nearby with a needle in her hands. Li Rin watched them for a long time. Then she walked down to the shore. She moved cautiously. The wound still hurt, but her back was straight and her step was steady. The step of someone who knows how to fight. She approached Ra-Han and said she had to leave, that she didn't want to cause trouble. Ra-Han didn't look up from the boat. He asked where she was going. Li Rin paused. She didn't know where. Ra-Han nodded and said there would be soup in the evening, if she wanted it. Li Rin stood over him, unable to understand this man. He didn't even look at her, didn't ask who she was, didn't ask why she was wounded. He simply offered her soup. She sat down on a rock nearby and stayed. On the 4th day, Ra-Han asked for her sword. Li Rin refused. She slept with the sword in her arms and never let it go. Ra-Han didn't insist. He said he could see something, that the center of her blade was worn out. The metal at the center of the blade bears a load that should be distributed along its entire length. The blade is tired, like a person who has carried too heavy a load on one shoulder for too long. Li Rin looked at him. No one had ever spoken of a sword like that. As if it were a living being, she slowly drew the blade from its sheath, placed it in her palm, held it out to him. Ra-Han took the sword with both hands, gently, as one would hold a newborn. He ran his finger along the blade from the hilt to the tip. Then he closed his eyes and ran his finger along it again. Then a 3rd time. Li Rin saw his lips move. He was reading the sword, like a formula, from top to bottom, line by line. And he saw where steps had been skipped. Where the metal wanted to go one way, but had been forced to go another. Where it had been forged roughly and quickly, instead of being forged properly. He opened his eyes and said he would fix it, but that the sword needed a month's rest, and so did she. Li Rin wanted to object. She wasn't used to being without a weapon, but Ra-Han was already gone into the house with her sword and sat down by the hearth. She remained alone on the shore, without a sword, for the first time in 4 years. Her hands were empty, and she didn't know what to do with them. That evening, So Mei told Ra-Han what she had learned from the fisherman on the southern routes. Li Rin, of the Li family, the heiress, she was being prepared for an engagement to the son of the Zheng family. A military alliance between the two families. Li Din refused. She took the family sword and fled at night. Her father declared her dead. The Zheng house sent men to retrieve the sword. Not her, the sword. A wound in her side from one of those men. Rahan listened and nodded. Then he said he would repair the sword. The rest was none of his business. Somei looked at him with that long gaze he was already beginning to recognize. A gaze that meant she saw more than he was saying. She asked if he wasn't afraid that people from the Zheng family would come to Noryang. Rahan said that those looking for Li Din wouldn't be searching in a fishing village. They were looking for a runaway heiress. And here there were only fishermen and one former accountant. Somei didn't answer, but you could tell from her face that she didn't agree. Rahan worked on the sword for 2 weeks. At night, during the day he worked on the boats and taught Hanil. At night he sat by the hearth with the blade on his knees, needle and salt, stitch by stitch. He moved slowly across the metal. Every millimeter was a line of a formula. The sword was more complex than anything he had ever made before. A net wants to hold, a boat wants to sail, a sword wants to cut. And this desire to cut must be directed correctly, not suppressed, not stifled, distributed, so that the weary center would pass some of the load to the edges, so that the blade would work as a whole, and not just at a single point. The formula came out to 60 lines, the longest of anything he had ever written. Li Rin came every evening. She sat by the door. She watched silently as he worked. She didn't ask questions. She didn't rush him. She just sat there. By the second week, Rahan noticed that she had started falling asleep by the door. She used to be a light sleeper. She'd wake up at the slightest sound, but now she fell asleep soundly and quietly. He didn't mention it to her, but Somei noticed it too. She brought Li Rin a blanket and placed it beside her. Li Rin woke up in the morning covered by it and stared at the blanket for a long time, as if it were something from another world. When Rahan returned her sword, Li Rin went out to the clearing beyond the village. Rahan, Somei, and Hanil followed her. Li Rin drew her blade. She took a stance and began to move. The first strike, the sword moved easily, like never before in 4 years. The second strike, the blade didn't tremble. It didn't vibrate. It didn't pull her hand off course. It went exactly where she directed it, precisely, cleanly, effortlessly. Li Rin moved faster, a series of strikes, 10, 20. She sliced through the air, and the air parted obediently. On the 30th strike, she stopped. She stood there, breathing heavily. She looked at the sword in her hand. Then she turned to Rahan. Her expression was strange, not gratitude, not surprise, confusion. She said quietly, "It's different." Rahan said no, the sword was the same. It was just that now it wasn't tired. Li Rin shook her head. She said it wasn't the sword, it was her. She was different with this sword. Before, she had held the weapon and felt the weight of her father, the weight of the engagement, and the weight of her escape. Now she held the weapon and felt only her own hand. Rahan didn't answer. He turned and walked back to the village because he still had to finish building the third boat from the second batch. Li Rin stood alone in the clearing with the sword in her hand, and for the first time in 4 years, she didn't know if she wanted to go anywhere, or if she wanted to stay. She stayed. The next day, she went to Somei and asked how she could help. Somei handed her a bucket and pointed to the well. Li Rin, heiress of the Li household, carried water all day without saying a word. In the evening, she sat on the pier and gazed out at the sea. Hanyul approached and sat down beside her. They were silent. Then Hanyul asked if she wanted to learn how to tie knots. Li Rin looked at the girl. She looked at her hands, the hands of a swordswoman, hands that knew only how to hold a blade. She said yes. Hanyul took out some thread and began to show her. Li Rin got tangled up in every knot. The thread slipped from her fingers, calloused from gripping a hilt. Hanyul patiently untangled it and showed her again. Rahan watched this from the window. He stood with a needle in his hand, watching the swordswoman learn to tie knots from a 12-year-old girl. And he smiled, quietly, just the corners of his lips. Somei stood nearby and saw it too. She said that Li Rin would stay. Rahan asked how she knew. Somei said that a woman who is learning to tie knots has no intention of leaving. Li Din, a fugitive swordswoman from the Li household, had come to Norin wounded and stayed. Rahan repaired her family sword by removing the fatigue from the center of the blade. For the first time in 4 years, Li Din felt free from the heavy burden of the past. She began learning to tie knots from Hanil. It is important to remember that the Zheng house is searching for Li Din and her sword, and that there is little time left before the tower's reply. The reply did not come from the towers. The reply came from the Duke. 6 weeks after Han Jiwoo's departure, a messenger arrived in Norin with a decree. The seal of Duke Kong Tae-sun, red wax bearing the imprint of a hawk. The decree was brief. The village of Norin is required to pay triple the tribute in full within 2 weeks. In case of non-payment, the village would pass into the Duke's direct possession. The residents would be resettled at the shipyards. There would be no exceptions. The messenger read the decree in the square and left. He did not stay the night. He did not even drink any water, as if he were afraid to linger. The villagers gathered at the village head's house. Kim Dae-ho scratched the back of his head and remained silent longer than usual. The fisherman counted aloud, a triple tribute: grain, fish, salt, and silver. Even with a new catch from the re-registered boats, they wouldn't be able to scrape together even half of it. There was no silver in the village at all. Someone suggested selling part of the catch at the market in Hagan. Another said it was a 2-day journey to Hagan, and the fish would go bad on the way. A third said they should head for the mountains before it was too late. The voices grew louder. Fear flowed through the crowd like water through cracks. Rahan stood in the back row and counted. Not money. Days. 2 weeks until the deadline. And then what? Soldiers. Maybe mages. Definitely ships. He counted and realized that hiding was pointless. The Duke won't forget. The Duke wants the shore, not the fish. The shore for shipyards. The shore for the 7th tower he's building. Norin sits on a good cove with deep water and a calm current. The perfect spot. The tribute is just an excuse. Even if they paid 3 times over, the Duke would find another excuse, and yet another, until the village is ruined. Rakan raised his hand. The crowd fell silent. He wasn't used to speaking in front of people. His voice was quiet, but everyone listened. He said the tribute must be paid, but not in silver, in fish, good fish, a lot of it. So much that it would be cheaper for the Duke to accept it than to refuse. And one more thing, he said that the decree mentioned tribute, not surrender. Tribute implies that the village is free and pays voluntarily. If they pay on time and in full, the Duke has no legal grounds for conquest. He can conquer by force, but that is no longer of the borderlands. It is war, and war must be explained to the other dukes and the towers. The village head asked where so much fish came from. Rahan said they had 5 modified boats that sail against the wind and catch 3 times as much, and that in 2 weeks he would manage to modify 3 more. 8 boats would yield a catch sufficient for both the tribute, and Cho Nam-gil asked what would happen if it wasn't enough. Rahan paused and said that in that case he would come up with something else. Cho Nam-gil snorted, but he didn't object. Rahan didn't sleep for 2 weeks. Literally. So-mei kept track. The first night he worked on the 6th boat, the second on the 7th. During the day, he taught Hanyul and repaired small items that people brought in. At night, he redrew the boats. On the 3rd day, Yunara came to him with a bowl of herbal tea and said that if he didn't sleep for at least 4 hours, he'd collapse, and she wouldn't be the one to pick him up. Rahan drank the tea. He lay down. He woke up 3 hours later and got back to work. Yunara was cursing. Rahan didn't hear her. He was inside the formula. The 6th boat, the 7th, 8th, each for its own master, each with coordinated transitions to the others. A fleet of 8 boats. Not a military one, a fishing fleet, but functioning as a single unit. Li Rin helped as best she could. She carried salt from the shore. She held the planks while Rahan worked. She stood guard when he fell asleep by the right on the sand. Hanyul worked beside him. She was already tying the formulaic knots on the sails, slower than her teacher, but correctly. On the 10th day, Rahan finished the 8th boat. He stood up, and the world swam before his eyes. His legs buckled. So-mei caught him by the shoulder. He weighed as much as a sack of bones. In 2 weeks, he had lost 10 jin. His cheeks were sunken, dark circles under his eyes. So-mei took him home and put him to bed. He resisted, said he hadn't yet checked the coordinating transitions on the 8th. So-mei said the transitions could wait, but he couldn't. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. Rahan looked at her hands, then at her face. He wanted to say something, but fell asleep before he could open his mouth. The fisherman went out to sea on the 11th day. 8 boats, all re-registered. They left at dawn and returned by noon. with full holds. The catch was enormous. The fish swam toward Somei's nets as if they were family. The spells on the boats and the spells on the nets worked together. The boats knew where the fish were. The nets knew how to hold them. 4 days of non-stop fishing. The village women salted, gutted, and dried the fish. Yun Ara organized the salting so the fish wouldn't spoil. Li Rin commanded the porters. Hanil wove new nets. The village worked like a machine in which every part was in its place. On the 14th day, 40 barrels of salted fish stood at the pier, 20 sacks of dried fish, 10 bundles of smoked fish, and 5 baskets of fresh fish. There was so much fish that it more than covered the triple tribute, with room to spare. Rahan sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, staring at the barrels. Somei sat beside him. He said there would be enough fish. Somei nodded. He said the Duke wouldn't let it go anyway. Somei nodded again. She knew. They both knew. The tribute was only a delay, not a solution. The collector arrived on time. Han Ji-woo again, with 4 guards this time. He saw the barrels at the dock and stopped. He counted them. His face hadn't changed, but his eyes had narrowed. He accepted the tribute in silence. The guards loaded the barrels onto the carts. Han Ji-woo walked through the village and looked again, at the boats, at the nets, at the frame by the well with Hanil's net, from which water was dripping, at the tiles on the village headman's roof. He was reading the formulas, every single one. Rahan saw this. He saw how the young mage traced his fingers through the air, committing what he saw to memory. Their eyes met again. Han Ji-woo approached him. They stood face to face, the young mage in a clean cloak with a golden clasp, the old accountant in a patched blanket. Han Ji-woo spoke quietly so that only Rahan could hear. He said he had sent a report, that they knew in the tower, that they were advising him to flee. Rahan looked him in the eyes and asked why he was warning him. Han Ji-woo did not answer. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away with the carts of fish. Rahan stood on the shore and thought. The young mage wasn't obligated to warn him. He had taken a risk. Warning the subject of a report is treason. So Han Ji-woo must have seen something in Rahan's spells that turned out to be more important than his career. Rahan didn't know exactly what it was, but he sensed it was important. The Duke had sent a decree demanding triple tribute within 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, Rahan had acquired 3 more boats, bringing his fleet to 8. The village had caught more fish than required. Han Ji-woo accepted the tribute, but warned Rahan that the towers knew about him. It is important to remember that Han Ji-woo showed compassion, which could be used later. Rahan is exhausted to the limit. After the collector left, Rahan slept for 2 days straight. Somei didn't wake him. Yunara came twice a day to check his pulse and place a decoction at the head of his bed. Li Rin sat on the porch with a sword on her lap. She didn't say she was standing guard, but she didn't leave either. Hanil came in the morning and evening. She sat by the wall and knitted knots, quietly, without disturbing anyone. The village went about its business. Fishermen set out to sea in their repaired boats. The catch remained steady. The barrel by the well filled with clean water every night. The village headman's roof didn't leak. Things worked. Rahan slept, and his spells continued to exist without him. Because he didn't cast spells, he made things right. A thing that is right doesn't need a mage nearby. He woke up on the 3rd day, sat up, rubbed his face, looked around, saw a bowl of cooled broth. He drank it. He saw a fresh shirt folded on a stool, from May. He changed and went out onto the porch. The sun was high in the sky. For the first time in 7 weeks, there was no fog. The bay lay open and sparkling, blue water, white rocks, boats on the waves, beautiful. Rahan stood and looked and thought that he had never noticed before that the sea was beautiful. There were no windows overlooking the sea in the tower, only walls and scrolls. So May approached from behind. She asked how he was feeling. He said he was fine. She said he was lying. Rahan smiled. She handed him a bowl of soup. He ate standing on the porch, looking out at the bay, and the soup was hot and salty and good. Then he went down to the shore and began to count. Not formulas, possibilities. Han Ji-woo had warned him. So the towers know. So there will be a reaction soon. What kind? The Dryleaf Tower will want him back. It's his home tower. They aren't fools. They'll realize they've driven away a valuable person and will want to correct their mistake, take him back, pretend nothing happened. That's not the worst option. The Tower of the Scarlet Mark. It's worse with them. The Scarlet Mark has monopolized the short formula. They sell combat spells to dukes across the continent. In their eyes, the long record is not an alternative. It is a threat.
If the formula can be inscribed on a net, a boat, or a mortar, then why pay the red mark for combat spells? They will want to kill him, or capture him and force him to keep quiet. Duke Kang. The Duke thinks differently. The Duke is a man of war. He will see Ra-Han as a weapon, a mage who turns every nail on a ship into a spell, an entire fleet of spells. The Duke will want him alive and obedient. 3 powers, 3 different desires. All 3 are directed at Norin. Ra-Han sat on a rock and weighed his options. None of them were good. Li Rin approached and sat down beside him. She said they needed to fortify the village. Ra-Han asked how. Li Rin said she knew about defense. 4 years of training at the Li household. Walls, vantage points, ambushes. Ra-Han shook his head. He said that walls wouldn't help. Against an Archon capable of burning the village from a ship, any wall is as thin as paper. Li Rin frowned. She asked what then? Ra-Han was silent for a long time. Then he said that the only defense was to become indispensable. War with Norin must cost more than peace, not in swords or walls, in what Norin provides: fish, water, things that work. If Norin became a place through which it was cheaper to transport salt and fish than through the Duke's ports, then destroying it would be unprofitable. Li Rin said it was a beautiful idea, but they had to survive long enough to see it through. Ra-Han nodded. He knew. That very day, he began to work differently. Before, he had repaired whatever was brought to him. Now he began to think of the village as a whole formula. Every house is a sign. Every path is a connection between signs. The pier, the well, the sheds, the boats. If you arrange them correctly, if every part falls into place like a plank in a boat and a knot in a net, then the village itself will become a formula, not a fortress, not a weapon, a place that functions correctly. He walked through Norin for 3 days and observed. He touched the walls of the houses. He counted the steps between the thresholds. He watched how the sun set on the roofs, how the water flows through the gutters, how the wind moves between the buildings. People looked at him and tapped their fingers against their temples. Uncle Han is acting strange again, but no one interfered. They had already seen what happens when he finishes acting strange. On the 4th day, he gathered Some, Li Rin, Yun Aru, and the village headman. He spread a large sheet of paper on the table. On it was a map of the village. Every house, every path, every stone. He pointed and explained. Here, the pier needs to be extended by 20 paces. Here, build a second shed for salting. Here, move the fence 3 cubits to the left. Trivialities, imperceptible changes, but each one brought the village closer to the right formula. Each one connected the parts into a whole. Some asked why the fence needed to be moved. Ra-Han said that if the fence were placed further to the left, the wind from the sea would blow between the fence and the shed wall, and dry the fish in a day instead of 3. Yun-Ara asked what defense had to do with it. Ra-Han said that a well-fed village that dries fish in a day can sell more, and a village that sells more needs to stay alive. Li Rin looked at the plan and said he had placed the well in the center. Ra-Han nodded. The well with Hanil's frame, clean water, the center of the village. Everything radiates out from it like rays from the sun. Li Rin nodded. She was beginning to understand. This wasn't a fortress plan. It was a city plan. Ra-Han had recovered after 2 weeks of grueling work and began to think strategically. He identified 3 threats: the Dry Leaf Tower, the Scarlet Mark Tower, and Duke Kang. His defense plan wasn't about walls, but about transforming Nordiang into a valuable place that was more profitable to preserve than to destroy. He drew up a plan to rebuild the village as a unified whole. It was important to remember that the towers already knew about Ra-Han, and a reaction was inevitable. The reconstruction of Norin took a month. Ra-Khan didn't tear down or rebuild. He moved things. The fence 3 cubits to the left. A stone from the village elder's threshold to the corner of the barn. The roof tiles on the second house, repositioned from the edge with a twist of a finger. Small things. Every day he gave the village one task. Simple, clear, move, shift, adjust. People did it without asking because they had already seen what happened when Uncle Khan asked them to do something strange. After a week, the wind dried the fish in a single day. After 2 weeks, rainwater drained into special channels and collected in barrels by the barns. After 3 weeks, it got warmer. Ra-Khan relaid the roof tiles on 6 houses, and now the houses kept the warmth of the hearth inside while leaving the cold outside. People didn't believe it. They touched the walls and didn't understand what had changed. The stones were the same, the wood was the same, but the house was warm. Ra-Khan didn't explain. He didn't have time for explanations. Hanil grew as a master every day. She mastered 3 types of formulaic knots: the holding knot, the releasing knot, and a new one she invented herself, the guiding knot, a knot that neither holds nor releases, but shows the way. She wove it into the net and hung the net on the mast of Chonam Gil's boat. The net swayed in the wind, and its movement showed where the fish were. Not exactly, roughly, but the fisherman quickly learned to read the net's sway, and the catch increased by another third. Rahan looked at his student's invention and said nothing. Then he quietly told Somei that in a year, Hanyul would be stronger than him. Somei asked if he wasn't afraid. Rahan said no, that a teacher who fears his student will become stronger is not a teacher. He is a jailer, like the towers. The 4th month. One morning, a figure appeared on the road to Noryun, a tall woman in a silk cloak, with a kayajim in a case on her back, 2 maids behind her, 1 guard. She walked slowly and winced at the smell of fish 300 paces from the village. Her name was Zhang Yua, 22 years old, the daughter of that very Han Ji Wu, on her mother's side from the Zhang family. The Duke had sent her as a cultural hostage, an observer, to live in Norin for a year and report back. Fine words for a beautiful spy. Yua entered the village and saw the mud, fish hanging on ropes, children with bare feet, an old man repairing a boat. She despised the place within a minute. She was to the village headman. Kim Dae-ho scratched the back of his head, unsure where to seat his guest in silk. Somei came in and silently placed a bowl of soup in front of Yua. Yua looked at the soup, at the bowl, at the table with salt stains, and didn't touch it. Rahan found out about her that evening. Somei told him. Rahan nodded. He wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting something like this. The Duke isn't a fool. It's too early to send soldiers. First, reconnaissance. Eyes and ears in the village. Yua is the perfect choice. Educated, observant, and related to Hanji Wu. Somei asked what to do. She couldn't be expelled. The Duke's decree. Rahan said not to expel her. Let her live. Let her watch. Let her see. Somei frowned. She said that Yua would report on everything. About the boats. About the nets. About the formulas. Rahan said he knew, and that this was exactly what he wanted. Somei looked at him with that look, a long one. He said the Duke must see that Norin is useful, that Norin produces fish and clean water and things that work. Yua will write about this, and the Duke will think, not now, but he'll think about it. Which is cheaper, to destroy it or to use it? Somei didn't answer, but in the morning she set up a second bed in her house. For Yua. Yua spent the first week in silent contempt. She didn't eat the fish soup. She brought her own food. She didn't talk to the fisherman. She wrote reports every evening, in neat handwriting on good paper. Rahan didn't interfere. He went about his business. He taught Hanil. He repaired things. He worked on the village plan, and he waited. On the 8th day he heard a sound, a quiet one, from the house where Yua lived. The strumming of a stringed instrument, a kayajim. Rahan stopped at the door. Yua was playing. The melody was beautiful and sad. Rahan didn't know much about music, but he knew about formulas, and in the sound of the kayajim he heard a crack. Not in the melody, in the instrument. One string sounded dull, as if through a cloth. The soundboard wasn't resonating fully. The kayajim was damaged, not on the outside, on the inside, an invisible crack in the wood. Yua finished playing and fell silent. Rahan knocked on the door. Yua opened it with a stony face. He said her instrument's voice had cracked. Yua didn't answer. She closed the door. The next day he came again. He knocked. Yua didn't open the door. He sat down by the door and said through the wood that he wasn't going to do anything to her kayajim without permission, that he could just hear that the instrument was in pain, and that if she wanted, he could help. Yua didn't answer. Rahan left. On the 3rd day, she came out herself. Silently, she handed him the kayajim. Rahan sat on the porch and placed the instrument on his lap. He ran his fingers over the soundboard, over the strings, over the pegs. The crack was inside, in the wood itself. Small, almost invisible, but it was disrupting the resonance. The kayajim was playing at 70% of its full potential. Yua had thought her whole life that this was how it was supposed to be. Rahan worked for 2 days. He mapped out the soundboard like a formula. He accounted for the length of each string, the tension, the tone, the material, and Yua's hands. The musician's long, slender fingers, the pressure she applied, her habit of starting a melody with low notes. The formula came out to 50 lines. He returned the kayajim. Yua sat down. She placed the instrument on her lap. She plucked the first string. The sound filled the room. Full, deep, pure, As if the instrument were breathing deeply for the first time in years, Yua froze. She plucked the second string, the third. She began to play. The same melody, the very same sad melody, but now it sounded so that So-mei stopped behind the wall, and Li Rin turned her head, and Ha-nil looked up from the internet. Yua was playing, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She played. For the first time in her life, she truly heard her instrument, and for the first time in her life, she cried because of her own music. Rahan stood in the doorway and waited. When she finished, he quietly turned to leave. Yua said, "Wait." He stopped. She asked why. Why had he fixed the spy's instrument? Rahan shrugged. He said that Kyajim wasn't spying. Kyajim just wanted to be heard. Yua was silent for a long time. Then she asked what he wanted in return. Rahan said nothing, but if she agreed, he'd like to hear it one more time. Yua looked at him and saw no lie, not in his eyes, not in his voice, not in his hands which he habitually wrung in front of him. She placed the Kyajim on her lap again and began to play. Rahan sat on the threshold, closed his eyes, and listened. Yua played until dark. That evening she ate fish soup from So-mei's bowl for the first time. The village had been rebuilt according to Rahan's plan and was now functioning more efficiently. Ha-nil had invented a guidance device for finding fish. Chong Yua arrived as the Duke's spy. Rahan repaired her Kyajim, and Yua heard the true voice of her instrument for the first time.
Rahan's strategy was to let Yua see the benefits of Norin and report exactly that to the Duke. It is important to remember that the towers have not yet sent their reply. The tower's reply came in the 5th month, not by letter, by a man. He was walking along the road to Norin in the morning fog, alone, without guards, wearing the cloak of the dry-leaf tower, green fabric with silver embroidery. Li Rin was the first to see him from the upper path. She ran down and told Rahan, "A mage is coming, alone, the tower of the dry leaf." Rahan set down his needle. His hands weren't shaking, but only because he forced them not to. He knew this day would come. He had hoped it would be later. 5 months, not long enough, so short. The mage's name was Wan So-yun, a third-rank emissary, about 35 years old, the face of a bureaucrat, a polite smile that meant nothing. He stopped in the square and introduced himself. He said that the dry-leaf tower had sent him with a proposal. To the Magister Choi, Rahan is being offered a return to the tower, full restoration of status, a private laboratory, research funding. The Tower Council is ready to acknowledge that the decision to remove him was hasty. Wan So-yun spoke smoothly, every word in its place, a rehearsed speech. Rahan listened while standing at the pier. So-mei stood behind him. Li Rin stood by the shed with his hand on his sword. Ha-nil sat on a rock and stared at the stranger mage without blinking. Yua watched from the window. Rahan waited until the emissary finished. Then he invited him into the house. So-mei placed a bowl of fish with seaweed and grains. Wan So-yun looked at the bowl and sat down. He was hungry. It had been a long journey. He ate, and Rahan remained silent. When the emissary had finished eating, Rahan said he was grateful for the offer, that he appreciated the tower's consideration, and that he would not return. Wan So-yun was not surprised. He had expected a refusal. It was written all over his face. He asked why. Rahan thought for a moment. Then he said that in the tower, he had written formulas that no one had read. 17 treatises in the archives. Not a single one published. Not a single one has been used. Here, he mends nets, and the nets catch fish. He repairs boats, and the boats carry people home. He repairs mortars, and the children stop getting sick. For 20 years, he searched for a place where his work was needed, and he found it. Why would he return to a place where his work was shelved? Wan So-yun nodded. He didn't argue. He took a scroll out of his bag. He said he had a second proposal, from the Council of the 6 Towers, not from the Dry-Leaf Tower, from all 6. The Council proposes granting Norin the status of an observed territory. The towers would take the village under their protection in exchange for access to Rahan's research. All formulas must be documented and transferred to the tower's archives. Rahan would work freely, but under supervision. Rahan read the scroll.
Between the lines, he saw what was not written. The towers wanted control, not of him, of his method, the long record. If the method ended up in the archives of the 6 towers, Ra-Han would become unnecessary. They would copy it, simplify it, make a short version of the long record, and everything would go back to the way it was. He placed the scroll on the table. He said he would think about it. Won So-yeon nodded. She said she would wait 3 days. Ra-Han thought for 3 days. He walked along the shore. He sat by the water. He counted. So-mei didn't bother him. She knew this silence. Li-rin approached him on the 2nd day and spoke plainly. If he decided to flee, she would go with him. She would cover for him. She would lead him away. She had connections on the southern border. They could leave by sea. Ra-Han shook his head. He said he wouldn't run. Li-rin pressed her lips together and left. Yunara came in the evening. She said nothing about the tower. She brought him some hand ointment and sat down next to him. Then she asked if he had seen Hanul crying. Ra-Han turned around. Yunara said that Hanul had overheard the conversation with the emissary and decided that the teacher was leaving, that the tower was taking him away, just as it had taken the children before. She had been crying for 2 days but hadn't come over because she was afraid of hearing confirmation. Ra-Han stood up. He found Hanil on the shore by the frame with the water net. She was sitting with her arms wrapped around her knees and wasn't crying. She had already cried it all out. Her eyes were red and empty. Ra-Han sat down next to her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there. They were silent for a long time. Then Ra-Han said he wasn't going anywhere, that the water net needed to be enlarged because there would be more fog in the winter and they could collect twice as much, and that tomorrow he would show her the 4th knot. Hanul turned toward him. She looked at him. Then she buried her face in his shoulder. Ra-Han awkwardly placed his hand on her head. He wasn't used to this. 20 years alone. No family, no children. And now a 13-year-old girl is crying on his shoulder because she's afraid he'll leave. He sat there, holding her head, and thought that the tower could offer anything. He wouldn't leave here. Not now. On the 3rd day, he gave his answer. Won So-yeon was standing in the square, ready to leave. Ra-Han came out to him and said he was rejecting the council's proposal, that his formulas did not belong to him. They belonged to the people for whom they were made. So-mei's net was So-mei's formula. Yoon-ara's mortar was Yoon-ara's formula. Bae Sung-ho's boat was Bae Sung-ho's formula. He could not hand them over to the archives because they were not his. Won So-yeon listened. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard. He said the council would be disappointed. Ra-Han said he understood. Won So-yeon was silent for a moment. Then he spoke more quietly. He said that personally he considered this a mistake, that the Tower of the Red Mark was already discussing other options, less polite ones. Ra-Han nodded. He knew. Won So-yeon turned toward his horse. Ra-Han called out to him, asked him to wait, went into the house, returned a minute later with a cloak in his hands, Won So-yeon's cloak. The emissary had left it to dry by the hearth 3 days ago. Ra-Han held out the cloak and said he had mended it, that the seam on the left shoulder had come apart, and that it would be cold in the mountains. Won So-yeon took the coat. He put it on, and paused. The coat was warm, not from the hearth, warm from the inside, a formula for warmth, sewn into the seam, tailored to his measurements, to the width of his shoulders. Won So-yeon stood in the warm cloak and looked at Ra-Han. Ra-Han bowed politely and wished him a safe journey. Won So-yeon left, in silence. So-mei approached when the emissary had disappeared around the corner. She asked why he had mended the enemy's cloak. Ra-Han said that Won So-yeon was not an enemy. He is a man with cold shoulders who was sent on a mission he himself dislikes. So-mei shook her head. She said he was an impossible man. Ra-Han shrugged and walked toward the pier. He had to show Hanul the 4th knot. The Dry Leaf Tower had sent the emissary Won So-yeon with a proposal to return Ra-Han and place Norin under surveillance in exchange for his formulas. Ra-Han refused both proposals. Hanul overcame her fear of losing her teacher. Ra-Han sewed the heat formula into the emissary's cloak. Won So-yeon left, warning that the Tower of the Red Mark was preparing a less peaceful response. It is important to remember that the cloak with the warmth formula may later save Won So-yeon's life and change his position. Tamara came from the sea. She was washed ashore on Norin, on a piece of a mast, during a stormy night in the 6th month. Li-rin found her in the morning on the rocks at the eastern cape. A tall woman with red hair stuck together with salt. A stranger. Her skin was lighter than anyone else's on the coast.
clothing of an unfamiliar cut. A leather case with maps was tied to her belt. She was unconscious. Her right leg was broken below the knee. 3 ribs were cracked. Yunara examined her and said she would live, but the leg would heal crooked if not set now. Rahan arrived after Yunara had already applied the splint. He looked at the leg, then at Yunara. He asked if he could. Yunara moved aside. Rahan sat down next to the stranger and placed his hands on the splint. He closed his eyes. A broken bone is an unfinished equation, like everything in the world. 2 fragments that want to become whole, but cannot find the right position. Rahan saw this. He saw the fracture line. He saw where the bone wanted to heal. He worked with a needle and salt directly on the splint, sewing in a formula, not for healing, directions. A formula that showed the bones where to grow. Yunara watched and said nothing. She understood what he was doing. It didn't replace her work. It complemented it. The bone held. The formula guided. Her ointment healed. Tamara woke up on the 2nd day. She spoke with a strong accent. She mangled her words. But she knew the language. She called herself Tamaran, a navigator on a merchant ship from the far northwest. The ship had been caught in a storm 4 days ago. A crew of 12. She was the only survivor. When she said this, her voice didn't waver, but her fingers clenched the edge of the blanket so tightly that her knuckles turned white. So May brought her some soup. Tamara ate greedily. Then she fell asleep. Then she woke up and demanded her maps. Li Rin brought the tube. Tamara took out the maps and spread them out on the floor. They were wet, smudged. The ink had run. The lines had lost their precision. Tamara looked at them, and her face looked as if she were looking at dead friends. The maps were the last thing left of the ship, of the crew, of 3 years at sea. Rakan walked in and saw the maps. He sat down next to her and asked if he could take a look. Tamara didn't want him to, but he was already looking. His fingers traced the blurred lines. He read the maps like a formula. The coastline is a curve. A curve has logic. If you know the logic, you can restore the erased sections. He worked for 3 hours. Tamara lay there watching as a stranger brought her maps back to life. He wasn't redrawing them. He was filling in the gaps. Where the ink had smudged, he marked dots with salt and a needle, every dot in its place. The map came alive under his hands. Coastlines emerged, shoals, currents, depths. Rakan paused at one spot. He frowned. He ran his finger over the section of the map where her ship's route had been marked on the night of the storm. Then he looked at Tamara and said that her calculations had been correct. Tamara didn't understand. Rakan pointed to the map. The route she had plotted ran between 2 currents, a perfect line. But at the storm's center, one of the currents had changed direction, not gradually, as happens with the moon or the wind, abruptly, as if it had been shifted. The balance of air and water in that spot had broken down on its own, for no reason. Tamara couldn't have known that, couldn't have foreseen it, couldn't have avoided it. Rakan said quietly, "Your calculations were correct. The storm was wrong. Those are different things." Tamara lay there and stared at the ceiling. Then she closed her eyes, and for the first time in 5 days, her shoulders relaxed. She was breathing. She was just breathing. For 3 years, she had carried the guilt for 12 people, and now a stranger in a fishing village had looked at her map and lifted that guilt with 2 sentences. Her leg healed in 3 weeks instead of 2 months. Yunara said it was her ointment. Rahan said it was his formula. They argued for half an hour. Tamara sat between them and smiled for the first time in 3 years. She stood up and went out onto the shore. She looked at the bay, at the boats, at the fog. Then she turned to Rahan and said she saw a problem. The bay was shallow at the entrance. Large ships wouldn't be able to enter. If he wanted to turn Norin into a port, he needed a fairway. Rahan nodded. He knew, but he wasn't a navigator. He didn't know the sea the way Tamara did. She knew the currents and the depths and the winds and the stars. He knew the formulas. Together, they could do what neither of them could do alone. Tamara looked at him for a long time. Then she said she had nowhere to go. The ship was at the bottom. The crew is dead. If he gives her a job, she'll stay. Rahan said there's more work than hands. Tamara nodded and walked toward the pier. So May watched her go and said quietly, 6. Rahan asked, "What?" So May said, 6 women. There are 6 women around you. Rahan blushed to his ears and mumbled that he just fixed things. So May didn't answer, but the corners of her lips twitched. Tamara, the navigator from the lost ship, was saved and stayed in Norin. Rahan restored her charts and cleared her of blame for the crew's deaths by proving that the storm was abnormal. Tamara began planning a fair way to turn Norin into a real port. It is important to remember that Tamara's leg healed thanks to the joint efforts of Yun Ara and Rahan, and that the air formula at the storm's epicenter broke down on its own, which may be related to fog anomalies. The 7th month. Norin was changing every day. Tamara worked with Rahan on the channel. She calculated the depths and currents. He translated her calculations into formulas and embedded them in the stones at the bottom of the bay, each stone in its place. Each stone directs the water just a little differently. 200 stones, a month's work. When they finished, the channel was 2 fathoms deeper and 10 paces wider, enough for medium-sized merchant ships.
Tamara stood on the cape and looked out at the bay. She said she had never seen anyone change the sea by placing stones. Rakan said he hadn't changed the sea. He had helped the sea find the path it wanted to take. Tamara snorted. But she didn't argue. She began mapping out new sea routes to Norin, routes for merchant ships, past pirate waters, past the Duke's patrols, safe, clear routes from the 3 nearest ports to Norin Bay. By the 7th month, Hanil could do what no tower adept could do after 5 years of training. She read things. She took an object in her hands and saw what was wrong with it. Not with formulas, with her hands, with her fingers. She felt where the wood was worn out, where the metal wanted to bend, where the thread was pulling in the wrong direction. Rahan realized that she wasn't just copying his method. She was developing her own. His method was sight. He saw the formula. Her method was touch. She felt the object. The result is the same. The path is different. He gathered So-mei, Li Rin, and Yun Aru that evening. He said it was time to open an academy. Not a tower, an academy. A place where they teach how to do things right, where a spark isn't needed, where hands and patience and a willingness to listen are needed. So-mei asked who to teach. Rahan said those whom the towers had cast out, those who were told they were defective, those who came to the exam and left empty-handed. There are hundreds of them across the continent. If at least 6 find their way to Norin, that's a start. Li Rin said that 6 isn't enough to defend against anything. Rahan said that 6 masters who make things for people are worth more than 6 archons who make weapons for dukes. Yun Ara said he was an idealist. Rahan didn't argue. A week later, So-mei sent messages via fishing boats that traveled to neighboring ports, short, unsigned notes. They contained a single sentence: if you've been rejected for being too slow, too tall, or too verbose, come to Norin and ask Uncle Han. Rahan didn't know about these notes. So-mei hadn't told him. She'd decided on her own. The 8th month began with bad news. Yua intercepted a pigeon, a report from someone in the Duke's garrison on the southern route. It stated that Duke Kang Tae-sun's fleet would be leaving Hagen Port in 10 days, 12 ships, heading for the northern coast. The destination was not specified, but the route passed through Norin Bay. Yua brought the note to Rahan. She shouldn't have done that. She was the Duke's spy. She was supposed to send the note back and report it. Instead, she stood before Rahan and held out the paper. Rahan took it. He read it. He looked at Yua. She said briefly, "Kayajim." Rahan didn't understand. Yua said that the man who repairs the instruments doesn't deserve to be burned at sea. Rahan nodded. Then he said thank you. Yua turned and left. She stopped at the threshold. She said without looking back, "An archon is coming with the fleet, a battle master, the dry leaf tower. His name is So-gyong." Rahan stood with the note in his hand, and the world around him grew very quiet. So-gyong. The 18-year-old boy who, 23 years ago, had burned his exam notes. Now he was 38, an archon, a battle mage, the best on the coast, capable of burning a ship from the shore with a single spell. 3 symbols, 4 seconds. Rahan had remembered those 4 seconds his whole life, every single one of them. The flames, the ashes of his notes, the adept's laughter, and then silence. He sat down on the porch. So-mei came out and sat beside him. She saw his face and asked no questions. She just sat there. An hour later, he told her. 10 days, 12 ships, Archon So-gyong. So-mei didn't flinch.
She said the soup was still hot. Rahan looked at her straight back, at her calm hands, at her face which showed no fear even though fear was there. He thought that this woman had gone out to sea alone for 3 years after the fog had taken her husband. She wasn't afraid. She simply did what needed to be done. He stood up and walked to the pier. There was work to be done. 10 days, a lot of work. Tamara and Rahan created a channel for merchant ships by deepening the bay with carefully placed stones. Rahan decided to open an academy for those rejected by the towers, so May secretly sent out invitations. Yua intercepted the report and warned Rahan that in 10 days, the Duke's fleet of 12 ships, led by Archon So Gyeong, was heading for Norin. It is important to remember that So Gyeong is the very man who burned Rahan's notes 23 years ago. For 10 days, Rahan worked, not on weapons, on Norin. He walked through the village and finished writing. Every wall, every roof, every stone of the path, every pier post, the formulas were laid out in thin lines of salt and needles, invisible, silent. The village didn't know what he was doing. He didn't explain. So May saw that he barely ate. She brought him food. She took it back, untouched. She brought it again. Lirin sharpened her sword every evening. She didn't ask about the plan. She was preparing for her own. If the spells didn't work, she would stand on the shore with her sword, 1 against 12 ships. She knew it was pointless, but she knew she would stand her ground. Hanil worked alongside the teacher. She wove nets, many, dozens, small ones, the size of a palm, each with formulaic knots. Rahan showed her a diagram, and she repeated it without stopping. Her fingers were already moving faster than his. She didn't ask why. She trusted him. Rahan hung these nets all over the village, on fences, on walls, on the pier's posts, on the masts of boats, between houses. The small nets hung like decorations, like little flags. No one understood why. Yunara asked directly. Rahan said it was a connection, that each net spoke to every other one, that when they all spoke at once, a voice would emerge. Yunara didn't understand. Rahan didn't explain further. He didn't have time. On the 5th day, he went down to the water, alone, at night. The fog stood like a wall, white, thick, warm. Rahan waded into the water up to his knees, then up to his waist. The fog embraced him. He stood in the warm whiteness and listened. 20 years in the archives had taught him to listen. He listened to the silence between the lines of the scrolls. He listened to the rustle of the pages. He listened to the scratch of the pen. Now he listened to the fog, and the fog listened to him. Rahan felt it. He didn't hear it. He felt it with his skin. The fog knew him. From the very first day, from the very first repaired net, from the very first stitch. Every formula he inscribed into an object resonated in the fog, like notes in a melody. For 8 months he had been finishing something greater than nets and boats. He was finishing the bay that had been an unfinished formula for 1,000 years, ever since the sea court had vanished into the fog. Rahan stood in the water and understood, not with his mind, with his body, with his hands, with his fingers. This fog is not the weather, it is the last living formula, a formula that waited for the one who would start making things for people. Not weapons for dukes, not short formulas for duels, things for specific people, with names, with aching backs, with calluses on their palms. Rahan came out of the water. He was shivering from the cold. So May was waiting for him on the shore with a blanket. She didn't ask why he had been standing in the water. She just wrapped him up and led him home. By the hearth, he sat wet and shivering and said nothing. Then he said he knew what to do. So May sat down across from him. He said that the bay is a formula. The fog is a formula. Norin stands within an unfinished sentence, and for 8 months he had been finishing it without knowing it. Every seam, every knot, every relayed tile, all of it is part of one enormous record, and that when the fleet enters the bay, the formula will speak. So May asked what it would say. Rahan shook his head. He didn't know, but he knew she would tell the truth. And the truth of Norin Bay is that it is a place where things are made for people, and that things made for people do not let in those who have come to destroy them. He spent the remaining 5 days on the bells. He remembered that first one, the copper one, Bobkin's, Somay's, the one that found Old Man Park in the fog. Now he had made 20. from whatever he could find: copper, tin, iron, one from a seashell. Each bell for a specific person: for Some, for Liden, for Yun Ara, for Hanu, for Yua, for Tamara, for village head Kyum, for Cho Namgil, for Be Sung Ho, for everyone who lived in Noryong and bore his mark. He handed out the bells in silence. He simply placed them in their hands and told them to wear them on their belts. People took them without asking. They were already used to it. If Uncle Han gives a strange thing, it means a strange thing is needed. Ra Han had sewn a 12-line formula into each bell, the same one as back then on the shore, the formula of pairs. Each bell knew its pair, and together they all knew each other. On the 9th day, Tamara climbed the cape and looked out to sea. By evening she came down and said, "Sails, on the horizon." 12. Ra Han spent 10 days preparing Norin for the fleet's arrival. He was finishing the formulas on every surface of the village. Hanil wove dozens of small nets, which he hung throughout the village as a single, interconnected system. Ra Khan stepped into the fog and realized that the bay was an unfinished formula of the sea court, which he had been completing for 8 months with every repaired object. He made 20 bells for each resident, a fleet of 12 ships on the horizon. Dawn of the 10th day, the fog lay over the bay like milk in a bowl, white and thick and still. Tamara stood on the cape with a spyglass and counted the sails. 12. A crescent formation, dark sails bearing Duke Kang's hawk. The ship sailed smoothly and swiftly, a favorable wind, battle formation. Tamara ran down and told Ra Khan, 2 hours, maybe less. Ra Han nodded. He stood at the pier and looked out at the bay. His hands hung at his sides, calm. He forced them to be calm. Inside, everything was trembling. 8 months of preparation, 8 months of stitches and knots and formulas, and now he would find out if it was worth anything at all, or if 12 ships would sail into the bay and burn everything down in an hour, just like So-gyong had burned his notes, in 4 seconds. So-mei came over and stood beside him. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, with her back straight, her face calm, in a jacket with a heat formula. Ra Han looked at her and thought that if it all ended today, at least it would be by her side. He didn't say it out loud. He was generally bad at talking about such things. But So-mei looked at him and nodded as if she'd heard him. Liren came out with a sword at her belt. She stood a little ahead, between the pier and the sea. She placed her hand on the hilt. Ra Han told her she wouldn't need the sword. Liren didn't answer. She didn't take her hand off the hilt. Yun Ara stood by her house with a medic's bag slung over her shoulder, ready. If there were any wounded, she would treat them. It was the only thing she knew how to do in battle, and she intended to do it until the very end. Han Nil sat on a rock by the well, holding a net in her hands, a small one, the size of her palm, a standard one. She didn't understand what to do with it in battle, but the teacher had given her this net and told her to hold it. She held it. Yua stood by the window with a kaya-jim in her hands. She didn't go out to the pier. She sat by the window and began to play, quietly. The melody faded into the mist. Tamara climbed back up to the cape. She watched the approaching fleet and counted the minutes. The village gathered on the shore, all 200+ people. No one was hiding. Ra Han hadn't asked them to come out. They came out on their own. Village head Kim Dae-ho stood at the front, hands at his sides. He wasn't scratching the back of his head, for the first time ever. Cho Nam-gil stood next to him, a knife on his belt, that very one, with the sewn-up handle. Pei Sun-ho, Fisherman Moon, wives, old men, children, all in jackets with thermal formulas, all with bells on their belts. The bells were silent. For now, they were silent. The fleet entered the bay. The first ship crossed the invisible line between the two capes. Ra Han felt it, as if someone had plucked a string stretched from one end of the bay to the other. The bay knew. A man stood at the bow of the flagship, broad-shouldered, in the cloak of the Tower of the Dry Leaf, green fabric with silver embroidery, a staff in his right hand. Archon So-gyong. Ra Han saw him clearly despite the distance, saw him as a formula, the same boy, 23 years later, heavy, with weary lines around his eyes, with cheekbones that had grown harder, with shoulders that bore the weight of hundreds of duels won, and not a single doubt. Until today, So-gyong raised his staff, a short dispersal formula, 3 signs. He knew about the fog. He had prepared. Any battle mage begins with dispersion if visibility is impaired. 3 signs, 4 seconds. Those very 4 seconds that Rahan had remembered his whole life. So Gyeong spoke the spell clearly and struck the air with his staff. A blue flash, the air shuddered, and nothing. The fog didn't budge. Not a single strand parted, not a single wisp shifted. So Gyeong frowned. He wasn't used to spells not working. His spells had always worked. 20 years, without exception. He struck again, harder. A brighter blue flash. The air hummed. The fog remained. A third strike. So Gyeong put so much force into it that the staff's shaft cracked in his hand. The flash was blinding. The sailors on deck shut their eyes, and when they opened them, the fog stood as it had stood, thick, white, warm, indifferent to the battle magic of the coast's finest archon. So Gyeong lowered his staff, cracked, useless. He looked down at the water and saw what he hadn't expected to see. The water stood still. The ships weren't moving. The rowers were rowing. The oars entered the water and came out. The sails were full. The wind was blowing. But the ships stood still, as if rooted in glass. The water wasn't holding them. It wasn't pushing them back. It wasn't forming a wall. It simply wouldn't let them through, quietly, effortlessly, like a door that isn't locked but won't open because the house behind it knows the guest has come with ill intent. So Gyeong turned to the captain of the flagship. The captain stood pale. He saw that the oars were rowing in vain, that the ship wouldn't respond to the helm, that the sails were full but useless. He had never seen anything like this. No one had ever seen such a thing. Battle mages on 4 ships tried their spells. Fire arrows, ice spears, wind blasts. Everything flared up and died out before reaching the shore. Not because a shield stood in the way. There was no shield. The spells simply refused to fly into this bay, like arrows that know their target is alive and refuse to kill. A short, stooped man in an old cloak stood on the pier. Rahan. He bowed. Politely, as one bows to a senior colleague upon meeting. His voice was quiet, but in the silence of the bay, where not a single spell worked and not a single ship moved, every word rang out over the water like the tolling of a bell. He said, "Adhont Sogyong. I'm sorry there's no tea. We're a bit busy here. If you'll allow me, I'll repair your staff. It looks a bit worn out." Sogyong stood at the bow of the flagship and looked at this man, 41 years old. Stooped, thin, without a single battle formula, without a staff, without a shield, with a needle in his pocket and a pouch of salt on his belt. An accountant, a blank space, a man whose notes burn in 4 seconds. And this man had just stopped 12 warships, not with fire, not with a shield, not with an army, by spending 8 months repairing people's nets and boats and mortars and knives and roofs. So Gyeong was silent for a long time. A minute, 2. The captain of the flagship waited for orders. The archers on the decks waited for orders. 4 battle mages on 4 ships waited for orders. 200 soldiers on 12 ships waited for orders. So Gyeong gave no orders. He looked at the shore, at the village, at the roofs he could have burned if the spells had worked, at the walls, at the pier, at the boats by the pier, at the nets on the fences, at the small flag-like nets between the houses, at the bells on people's belts, at the people, over 200 of them, old men, children, women with straight backs, fishermen with knives on their belts, and not a single weapon, not a single shield, not a single mage, except for a stooped man on the pier who offered to repair his staff. So Gyeong looked at his staff, cracked, useless, silent. Then he looked at the village. Every plank of the pier, every stone of the path, every tile on the roof, everything was a formula. He saw it now. Long formulas, dozens of lines, woven into every object. Not weapons, not shields, just the right things. A net that catches fish, a roof that doesn't leak, a well with clean water, a boat that carries you home. And all these things said one thing: people live here. Things are made here for people. Leave. So Gyeong lowered the rowboat, alone, without guards. He left his sword on the ship. He took only his staff. He sat in the rowboat and took the oars. The water carried the rowboat. It moved easily, obediently. The water knew he was going alone, that he had left his sword behind, that he carried only a broken staff. He pulled up to the pier, stepped out, stood before Rahan. They stood face to face. 2 magicians, one great, one former, one with a staff capable of burning ships, the other with a needle capable of mending mortars. 23 years between them, 4 seconds of burning notes, 40 lines of a formula against 3 symbols. So-kyung was a head taller, broader in the shoulders, younger, stronger. But here on this pier, on these planks into which the formula was sewn, he felt small, like a boy before a teacher. He held out the staff, silently, not understanding why. Ra-han took it, with both hands, gently, as one would hold a sick child. He sat down right on the pier planks, placed the staff on his knees, took out a needle, took out a small bag of salt, and began to work. So-kyung stood over him and watched. The needle moved across the wood, slowly, exactly. The lines of salt were as thin as a hair. The formula unfolded, line by line. So-kyung counted the lines. 10, 20, 30, 50, 70. He lost count at 80. He had never seen a formula this long. In the tower, the longest formula he knew was 12 lines, and it was considered excessive, ancient, outdated. And here, a stooped man on the pier was writing over 80 lines, and every line was clear, pure, essential. Between the symbols So-kyung knew lay steps, dozens of steps, those very omitted steps that ancient authors kept in mind as obvious, which modern magicians had forgotten, which So-kyung had never known existed. He watched as Ra-han inscribed them one by one, and he saw, through his own short formula, a long one emerged, like an adult's handwriting through a child's, like a building through a sketch. His 3 symbols were a stump, a stub, a shard of something whole and immense. For 20 years he thought he possessed magic, but he possessed a fragment. Ra-han worked for an hour. No one moved, not on the shore, not on the ships. 12 ships stood in the bay, and the crews watched the pier. Over 200 people stood on the shore and watched the pier. The world had narrowed down to 2 people, a stooped old man with a needle, a straight-backed warrior with empty hands. Yua played by the window. The melody floated over the water, quiet, wordless, a melody that said what people cannot say with their voices. Ra-han finished. He ran his finger over the staff one last time. He stood up. His knees creaked. His back ached. He held out the staff again. So-kyung took it and froze. The staff was warm, not from work, not from the sun that wasn't there, warm from the inside, like the hand of a living person. So-kyung gripped the shaft and felt every knot in the wood, every growth ring, every crack that was now not a crack but part of the pattern. The staff was speaking to him. For 20 years, So-kyung had worked with this staff. He had struck with it, burned with it, killed with it, and never once had he heard it. But now he heard it. The staff was tired, just like its owner, and Ra-han did not remove the weariness. He made room for it, wove it into the formula. The weariness became part of the staff, just as scars are part of a person. So-kyung raised the staff. He tried the formula, his own, the formula of dispersion. 3 symbols, the same 3 symbols as always. But now, behind them, he saw. He saw all 80 steps between the symbols. The formula unfurled like a scroll, complete, whole, alive. So-kyung saw it for the first time, though he had recited it 1,000 times. It was like seeing the face of a person with whom he had lived in the same room for 20 years. He lowered the staff. His hands were trembling, not from fatigue, from understanding. 23 years ago, he had burned the notes of the only person on the continent who had seen magic in its entirety, who knew every step, who wrote at length not because he couldn't write briefly, but because brief means blind. So-kyung looked at Ra-han. Ra-han wasn't looking at him. He was looking into the water, as if there were something in the water more important than 12 warships. Ra-han said quietly, "Please leave, Lord Archon, and tell the Duke, we will pay the tribute, with fish, as our forefathers did, nothing more." So-kyung was silent. He wanted to say something about those 4 seconds, about the notes, about the mistake. He couldn't. The words wouldn't come. 20 years of short formulas had taught him not to speak at length. He turned toward the rowboat, sat down, rowed back, climbed aboard the flagship, stood at the bow, raised his staff, a warm staff, and gave the signal to depart. 12 ships slowly turned around, heavily, clumsily.
like people who came to fight but found there was no one to fight and no reason to. The water let them go. It knew they were leaving. The ships left the bay one after another. The dark sails with the hawk dissolved into the fog. The flagship was the last to leave. So-gyong stood at the stern and looked back, at the pier, at the stooped figure in an old cloak, at the village, at the people. He watched until everything vanished into the whiteness. Everyone was standing on the shore. So-mei, Li Rin with his hand on the sword that never left its sheath, Yun-ara with a doctor's bag slung over her shoulder, Ha-nil with a net in his hands, Yua with a kyajim on his back, Tamara with a map in a tube, village head Kim Dae-ho, Cho Nam-gil, Bae Sung-ho, Grandma Kim with a cat in her arms, children in warm jackets, fishermen with knives that fit in their hands like an extension of themselves. Over 200 people. No one shouted, "Hurrah!" No one wept with joy. Everyone was silent, because the victory didn't look the way they had expected. There was no fire. There was no thunder. There was no hero with a sword on the edge of the cliff. There was an old man who had been sitting on the pier planks for an hour, mending someone else's staff. And the enemy had left. Not defeated, not broken, changed. It was stranger than victory. It was quieter. And that silence squeezed the throat tighter than any scream. So Mei was the first to approach. She took the needle from Ra-han's trembling fingers. His fingers were shaking so badly that he couldn't unclench them himself. She unclenched them, gently, finger by finger. She took the needle, put it in her jacket pocket. She said quietly, "Let's go home, Ajosi. The soup will get cold." Ra-han followed her. His legs wouldn't hold him. His knees buckled. Li Rin took his right elbow. Yun-ara took his left. Ha-nil walked ahead, clearing stones from the path. Though there were no stones, she just wanted to be helpful. Yua followed behind. Tears streamed down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. Tamara brought up the rear. She walked and looked back at the bay. The fog hung white and still, and to those who knew how to look, those who had spent 8 months learning to see formulas in ordinary things, it seemed as though the fog was smiling, broadly, wearily, like an old man who had waited 1,000 years for guests and finally saw light in the windows. The Duke's fleet of 12 ships, with Archon So-gyong at the helm, entered Norin Bay. The bay's formulas stopped the ships. The water would not let them through. The battle formulas didn't work. So-gyong went ashore alone and handed his staff to Ra-han. Ra-han repaired the staff with a formula of over 80 lines. For the first time, So-gyong saw the long formula behind his 3 symbols and realized that for 23 years he had been working with a fragment of magic. The fleet turned around and left. So-gyong left not defeated, but shaken. The fog over the bay smiled. It is important to remember that So-gyong took with him the warm staff and new knowledge. Winter came a month after the fleet departed. The first snow fell on the roofs of Noryang at night. Quiet, windless. In the morning, Ra-han stepped out onto the porch and saw white. White roofs, white paths, white stones on the shore, and the fog over the bay was white too, but a different kind of white. Warm. The snow was cold, the fog was warm. 2 white worlds side by side. Ra-han stood on the porch and breathed in the winter air. It was warm inside the houses. The tile formula kept the heat from the hearths inside. He had retiled all the roofs over the fall. Every house, 23 houses, every tile in its place. The children ran out into the street in the jackets he had sewn, each jacket tailored for a specific child, with a warmth formula in the seams. The children slid through the snow and laughed. For the first time, Narayana's winter children weren't cold. For the first time in 20 years. The mother of 3 little ones stood in the doorway and watched her children rolling around in the snow. Before, she wouldn't let them go past the threshold in winter. Their jackets were thin and full of holes, and the children got sick from every gust of wind. Now they were making snowballs and laughing, and she stood there, not knowing what to do with her hands, which were used to holding the children close to keep them warm. A year had passed. Han hadn't been counting the days on purpose. It was just that one morning, Some said that exactly a year ago he had arrived in Norin, in the rain, with a soaked sack. Han fell into thought. A year, a whole year, or just a year, he couldn't decide. It felt as though he had lived here forever, and it felt like just yesterday he was standing on the muddy road, looking down at three little lights in the fog. A year ago he was a nobody, an outcast with a sack of rice, a former master, an accountant, a nobody, a man whom the tower had spat out like a seed. And now, he looked out the window at the village, at the port. Norin had changed. Not a village, not yet a city, something alive in between, a place that breathed and grew and fed its people. Tamara had brought the channel to full working order. The stones on the bottom lay even, the current flowed obediently. The depth allowed merchant ships to enter the bay without fear of running aground. The first merchant ship entered Norin in late autumn. The captain was from Hagon. He was carrying salt south. Usually he sailed along the coast without entering the shallow bays. But Tamara met him on the approach in a pilot boat. She guided him through the channel. She showed him the depths. She offered him a berth. The captain saw the pier. He saw barrels of fish. He saw a barrel of fresh water. He saw the prices. He did the math. Calling at Norin saved him 2 days of travel and a third of his provisions costs. He left satisfied. 3 weeks later, he returned, with 2 other captains. The word spread along the coast like a wave from a thrown stone. There is a bay, deep, quiet, safe, with clean fresh water, with fish that is cheaper than in the Duke's ports, with a dock where boats are repaired so they sail faster than new ones, and with a man who can patch a crack in the hull overnight so the ship sails smoother than when it left the slipway. The merchants count their money. Norin saved them time, and time is money. So May became head of the Fisherman's Council. There was no vote. There was no appointment. Everyone simply knew she was the one who made the decisions. For 3 years she had held the village together after her husband's death. Now the village had become a port, and she held the port together. She sat at the meetings with her back straight and spoke little. She calculated a lot. She knew who had caught how much, and who owed how much, and who needed a new boat before anyone else. Han sat next to her at the meetings and wrung his hands. He was still shy when more than 3 people looked at him, so May didn't force him to speak. She knew his work wasn't in words. In the evenings, she still set a bowl of soup in front of him, fish soup, with seaweed and grains, hot. He ate, and she sat across from him, and they were silent. Not because there was nothing to talk about, because they didn't need words to be together. The jacket on her shoulders, that very one, the first one, the shape of her shoulders, the way she leaned over the net, the jacket kept only her warm. 8 months, every day. With May, she didn't take it off even when it was warm. She said she was used to it. Han knew it wasn't about habit, but he didn't say anything. He wasn't good at talking about such things anyway. Yun Ara opened a clinic, 2 rooms in a new house by the well, a table, shelves with herbs, dried roots on ropes hanging from the ceiling, a mortar and pestle set in the center of the table, that very one, the first one, with the crack that had become part of the pattern. Yunara didn't just treat the Norin. People came to her from 3 neighboring villages. They made their way by boat, on foot. One man brought his sick son in a cart after a 2-day journey. Word spread along the coast about the healer whose decoctions were 3 times stronger than usual. Yunara grumbled that she had no time, that she was alone, that people kept coming and coming, but she only had 2 hands. But she saw everyone. She listened to everyone. She brewed a potion for everyone in the mortar that Uncle Han had repaired. She no longer said she hated magic. She said that magic comes in different forms. There is the kind that killed her sister, and there is the kind that helps her mortar work so that the herbs give up everything they can. These are different things. Li Rin became captain of the Norin Guard. Guard is a grand word for 12 girls with spears. The girls came from the surrounding villages. Some had run away from an engagement, just like Li Rin herself. Someone had lost their family. Someone simply wanted to be able to defend themselves. Li Rin didn't ask why. She taught, strictly, silently. The spears were just right. Han had customized each one to fit each girl's arm, to her height, to the length of her stride, to the width of her shoulder. The spears were not weapons in the usual sense. They were not sharpened for killing. They were sharpened for defense. The design in each shaft knew its owner and worked with her, not for her. Li Rin trained the guard every morning, and in the evenings, she sat on the pier and knotted ropes with Hanil. Her fingers were too rough for delicate work. The knots came out crooked and thick. Hanil patiently untangled them every time and showed her how to do it again. Li Rin didn't get angry. She was used to having to fight for everything, knots included. Park Hanyul, 13 years old, 14 in a month. The first student at the first academy who hadn't yet received a title.
By winter, she knew more than half the third circle adepts of any tower on the continent. She read things with her hands. She felt wood and metal and fabric with her fingers the way a blind person reads text. She mended. She added to it. Her network by the well worked every night without a break. A barrel of clean water by morning, every day. Over 200 people drank that water, and not a single child had had an upset stomach since the net appeared. Hanil didn't think about that. She thought about how to make a net that catches the wind, not for a sail, for a house, so that in winter, when the wind from the sea pierced the walls, the net on the wall would catch the wind and turn it into heat. She presented the idea to Rahan. He listened intently. He asked questions. He drew diagrams. They argued until midnight. Somay brought them tea twice. The third time, she took the cups away and said they both needed to sleep. Rahan and Hanyul exchanged a conspiratorial glance. Somay shook her head and left. Yua stayed. 3 months ago, she had stopped writing reports. The Duke sent a messenger. Yua wrote her reply in a single line. She remains in Norin as a resident, not as an observer. The messenger took the reply away. Silence. The Duke did not reply. Perhaps he was thinking it over. Perhaps he had matters more important than a fugitive spy. Perhaps he understood. Every evening, Yua went out to the pier with the Kaya Jim. She sat on the edge, her feet over the water. She played. The sound carried across the bay. Clear, full, deep. That voice the Kaya Jim hadn't had before Rakan. People got used to it. The evening sound of the Kaya Jim became part of Norin, like the smell of fish and the sound of the waves and the whiteness of the fog. Yua played and didn't think about the Duke, didn't think about the house of Che. She didn't think about silk and gold clasps. She thought about the melody, and about the man who had repaired her voice, not the Kaya Jim's, her own. Because ever since the Kaya Jim began to sound truly like itself, Yua had started to speak differently, quieter, calmer, more confidently, like a person who had finally heard herself. Tamara became the chief navigator of the port of Norin. She drew up a complete map of the coastline, currents, depths, winds, shoals, rocks, safe routes, dangerous ones. Every merchant ship entering the bay received a pilot chart from her, free of charge, hand-drawn on high-quality paper that Hanil made using a water-repellent formula. The pilot chart didn't get wet in a storm. The captains appreciated that. Tamara didn't smile often, but when a ship left the bay following her route and returned safe and sound, she would stand on the cape and watch, and her face looked as if every returning ship brought her back a small piece of that crew she hadn't been able to guide through the storm. A map bearing the traces of that storm hung on her wall. Next to it hung a new map, clean, with smooth lines. A map of Norin and its waters. Her map. The first map she had drawn not for a lost ship, but for living people. A winter evening, exactly 1 year since Rahan's arrival. Somay had organized a celebration, the first year of Norin Freeport. That was what this place was now called, officially. Village head Kim Dae-ho had written on the board by the pier, Norin Freeport, founded in the year of the gray seagull. A long table on the pier. The pier planks were warm from the spell. Snow didn't settle on them. Fish, soup, 3 kinds of soup because Somay had been cooking all day. Rice. Sweet flatbreads baked by the village headman's wife, rice wine and plum wine, lanterns on ropes between the pier posts, yellow and red. Hanil had woven the formula into the lantern ropes, and the lights burned steadily without flickering, even in the wind. All 6 women. Somay at the head of the table in her jacket, Yunara next to the mortar she brought with her, because someone was bound to overeat, and she'd have to brew a stomach remedy. Lead-in a raincoat with a sewn-up seam, she left her sword at home, for the first time in a year. Hanil in the new jacket Rahan sewed for her birthday, 14 years old in a week. Yua with her Kaya Jim. Tamara with a cup of wine, which she raised before anyone else because in her homeland they drink first. All the students, there were 6 of them so far. 4 had arrived in the last 2 months, based on the notes Somay had sent via fishing boats. Girls aged 14 to 17, all without a spark, all outcasts, all with hands that know how to work. Rahan met each one personally. He asked their names. He repaired the first broken item each of them brought. One brought a comb with a broken tooth, another a cracked clay cup, a third an old doll missing an arm. The fourth brought nothing because she had nothing. Rahan took off his scarf and gave it to her. Then that evening, he sewed the scarf back for an hour. He sewed a spell into it. He returned it. The girl wore the scarf without taking it off. It warmed her neck, only her neck.
Village head Kim Dae-ho, the fisherman. Cho Nam-gil with his wife and 2 sons. Ba Sung-ho was alone because his wife had died 10 years ago, but he had a boat at the pier that he named after his wife. Fisherman Moon with a repaired bucket in which he now carried not fish but flowers for his wife, because the bucket no longer leaked and his wife said the bucket was too beautiful for fish. Grandma Kim with a cat on her lap. The cat ate from its bowl of formula regularly and purred. Children. 27 children, in jackets, with bells, laughing. Over 200 people at a single table on a warm pier on a winter evening. The bells on their belts jingled softly, all together, in unison, like the breath of a single being. Rahan stood up to make a toast. So May had asked him that morning, "Say at least a word, people are waiting." Rahan promised. He stood up, took the bowl, raised it, opened his mouth, and stopped. He looked at the faces, at all those faces, at So-mei in the jacket he'd tailored to her measurements, at Yuna with the mortar he'd finished making according to her recipes, at Li Rin in the coat he'd sewn because her shoulders were cold, at Hanner, who wove the nets that fed the village, at Yua, who was crying over her own music, at Tamara, who was guiding the ships home, at the village elder under the roof he had been repairing for 3 days, at Cho Nam-gil with the knife that knew his palm, at Bae-sung-ho on his right side in the boat that knew his habit, at the children in the jackets he sewed at night, to the old men drinking water from the Hanil network, to the schoolgirls in scarves and jackets. Each of these people had his work in their pocket, or on their shoulders, or at their waist, or in their home, his stitch, his knot, his formula, written for a specific person, to his measure, to his habit, to his name. He didn't build a city, he mended people's things, and the city just happened on its own. It grew out of seams and knots and properly laid roof tiles, just as a tree grows from seeds that the wind carries without thinking of the forest. Rakan set the bowl on the table. He couldn't speak, his throat tightened. He sat back down on the bench, and he cried, quietly, soundlessly. Tears streamed down his cheeks and fell into the bowl of soup. He cried and couldn't stop. For 20 years they called him a nobody, an accountant, a paper man, a man who turned magic into bookkeeping. For 20 years he believed they were right, that no one needed his long formulas, that his meticulousness was a weakness, that the world belonged to those who were quick and concise and beautiful. But it turned out that wasn't true. It turned out that the world belongs to those who sit up at night with a needle and salt, mending other people's sandals because they can't just walk by. So-mei placed her palm on his arm, not on his sleeve, on his arm. Her palm was warm and rough from oars and nets. She didn't stroke it. She didn't stroke it. She just held it. That was enough. Yun-ara silently poured him more soup, a full bowl, hot. She didn't say a word. She rarely spoke at all when she was doing something kind. Li Rin rose from her seat. She walked around the table. She took off her cloak, the one with the sewn-up seam and the warmth formula in the lining. She draped it over his shoulders. Rahan felt the warmth, double warmth, the formula and the living warmth from her body that the cloak still held. Hanil ran up with a napkin, a little girl, 14 years old, with a serious face, with the hands of a master that the tower didn't want to look at. She held out the napkin and waited. Rahan took it, wiped his face. The napkin smelled of salt and clean water. Hanil had made it herself, from the net. Yua placed her hands on the kayajim, plucked the first string. The sound flew over the pier, over the water, over the bay, clear and full. A melody, that very one, which used to be sad, but now it sounded different. Not sad, not cheerful. It sounded like home, like soup on the table, like a blanket by the hearth, like a hand on a hand, like warmth in a cloak, like everything that was made for someone specific. Tamara stood up first. She always stood up first. A navigator's habit. The navigator gives the signal, and the crew follows. She raised her cup high, straightened her back.
Her red hair glowed in the lamplight, and she said in an even voice, with an accent that hadn't faded and never would, "To Uncle Khan, who fixed us all." The people raised their cups, everyone, together, over 200 cups above a single table, in silence, without words. Words weren't needed. They drank, they set down their cups. The bells rang out all at once, a single note, clear, long. It drifted over the water into the fog, and the mist took it in and answered. Far away in the white depths of the bay, something stirred, light, warm and steady. Not fire, not magic in the sense the towers knew it. Light like from a hearth in a house where someone is waiting. Rakan raised his head. He wiped his face. He looked at the bay, and he saw it. In the mist, on the water, a warm, golden glow. It did not move toward the shore. It did not beckon. It did not call. It simply was, like an answer to the question Rakan had been asking his entire life. Is there a place in the world for someone who does things slowly and meticulously, and for a specific person? The light said there was. The sea court, 1,000 years in the mist, 1,000 years in an unfinished formula, a community of craftsmen who made things for people, not weapons for dukes, not short formulas for duels, things, nets that feed, boats that carry home, roofs that don't leak, bells that find the lost. The towers destroyed the sea court 1,000 years ago. They took its magic, shortened it, simplified it, turned it into a weapon, and sold it to the dukes. But the sea court did not die. It retreated into the mist. It curled up into its final spell, and waited. Waited for someone to come and start over. Not by order, not for money, not for power, simply because they would see a broken net and not be able to walk past it. Rahan stood up, so May stood beside him. Li Rin, Yun Ara, Hanil, Yua, Tamara. They stood on the pier and watched the light in the fog. The rest stood up too. All of Norin, over 200 people, children in their parents' arms, old people leaning on their grandchildren, fishermen with their wives, students with their master. Everyone was watching. The light in the fog burned steadily, and to those who could see formulas in ordinary things, could see that the light was not just light. It was a line, the last line of the bay's formula, the formula that Rahan had been completing all year, with every mended net, with every stitched seam, with every knot, with every roof tile, with every bell, with every jacket, every mortar, every knife, every boat. The line completed itself. The formula became whole. For the first time in 1,000 years, Norin Bay was a complete sentence. The fog grew thinner. It did not disappear. It didn't dissipate. It became more transparent. As if it had opened its eyes slightly, outlines emerged through it, distant, blurred, structures, not ruins, alive, with roofs and walls and docks, a city in the fog, a city of craftsmen, the sea court. It didn't emerge, it didn't materialize, it became visible, like a star becomes visible when a cloud passes. It had always been here, for 1,000 years, behind the white wall, and it waited. Rakan watched and understood. This is not the end, this is the beginning. Ahead lies the Tower of the Red Sign and its assassins. Ahead lies Duke Kang and his fleet, which will return. Ahead lay the Council of the Six Towers and their fear that their monopolies were crumbling. Ahead lay years of work, sleepless nights, worn-out fingers, new students who would come following Somei's notes and merchants' rumors. Dozens, then hundreds, all without a spark, all rejected by the tower's standards, all with hands that know how to make things. Ahead lies the Second Academy, and the third. Ahead lies a fleet of formula boats. Ahead lies the day when Wan Soyan returns not as an enemy, but as a man whose cloak saved his life in the mountains. Ahead lies the day when Sogyong will set his warm staff aside and sit down to listen. Ahead lies the day when the masters of the sea court will emerge from the fog, old, tired, grateful, because someone has finally started making things for people. But that's later. Now it's a winter evening, the lanterns are lit, soup steams in the bowls, Kaya Jim sings, bells ring, snow lies on the stones, but the pier is warm. Children laugh, the old men are drinking wine. Somei stands beside him, her hand on his arm, not on his sleeve, on his arm, and he doesn't pull away. Somei said quietly, "Let's go home. The soup will get cold." Rahan looked at her face in the light of the mist and the lanterns, at her straight back, which bore the weight of 3 years of loneliness and a year of the impossible, at her dark, calm eyes, in which the golden light from the bay stood. He nodded. They walked along the pier. Li Rin walked on the right, Yoon Ara on the left, Ha Neil in front, Yua behind, with the Kayajim still singing softly. Tamara brought up the rear, glancing back at the light in the bay. The whole of Norin followed behind them, over 200 people. Along the warm pier, past the motorboats, past the nets on the fences, past Ha Neil's well with its frame, past Yoon Ara's clinic, past the village headman's house with a roof that didn't leak, past everything that had been repaired and finished and done right. Home. And in the cove, the fog hung and glowed, warm, alive. For 1,000 years it had waited, and it had waited in vain. Not for a hero with a staff, not for an archon with fire, but for a man with a needle, who came in the rain with a soaked sack, who sat on a wet rock and asked for a needle, who mended the net. Then the bell, then a mortar, then a knife, then a boat, then a roof, then a sword, then a Kayajim, then a map, then a village, then a bay, then the whole world, stitch by stitch, knot by knot, formula by formula, for specific people, with names, with aching backs, with children who are freezing, with dreams that have been shattered, with lives that have cracked right down the middle. He mended, he just mended, because he couldn't walk by, and the world was mended.